And we welcome you to This is Wrestling. Vince McMahon, the Netflix documentary, episode number 1, Versage and Zach McGibbon. Zach, always great to be able to talk to you and looking forward to going through all of the episodes here with the Vince McMahon documentary on Netflix, Mr. McMahon, and there is a lot to get to. And again, as when I say looking forward to it, I mean it. You know, there's going to be some ups, there's going to be some downs, but I think every person that has ever sort of been involved in wrestling in some capacity has some interest in how Netflix is portraying Vince McMahon. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, Lee. Yeah, this is something that should be interesting to kind of break down over the next couple of episodes here with this Vince McMahon doc. A lot of people have been talking about it. I've been getting a lot of texts. People have been coming up to me asking how we will be covering this show. So looking forward to kind of breaking it down by each episode and seeing what they reveal, what they talk about, what they decide not to talk about as well with each episode. So I'm looking forward to breaking this down and kind of getting a better understanding of what Netflix was approaching here with this Vince McMahon documentary series.
Episode number 1, Junior. And really going through a lot of, you know, how Vince McMahon came to power in the WWF, WWE, a little bit about his father. And, you know, I have no idea what's to come here in the following episodes because I'm going to watch it as we go here and, you know, watch the episode. We'll talk about it. Then I'll watch the next episode and we'll talk about it. So this is not, I've watched the entire thing. I thought it was really interesting to begin with how it was. I understand how documentaries work, Zach, and I do understand providing the background of kind of what's to come later on. But this was a very, I thought, light episode number 1 where they were just setting up kind of what and who Vince McMahon really was. I was even a little bit shocked that there was a point where if you didn't know Vince McMahon whatsoever, you might have felt bad for him as far as his dad is concerned. And like all the things that happened to him, allegedly, as a young child coming up and not knowing his father. I thought the setup was interesting and almost made him, you know, a sympathetic figure in the beginning.
Yeah, they really laid the groundwork here, as you mentioned, understanding his background, growing up in a trailer park in North Carolina, and, you know, being raised by his mother and his stepfather, and, you know, alleging the abuse that occurred to him during that time, and not knowing who his real father was until he was about 12 years old. They really kind of touched on that here. You know, it's been a topic for a long time in terms of the upbringing of Vince McMahon, because even going to this documentary, they started off saying, you know, boy, I wish I could tell you the real stories. And then the producer's saying, well, why don't you tell the real stories? It's like, oh, I won't give you that. So I'll give you some good stuff here, but I won't give you everything. And it just kind of sets the tone right away of a guy that has been guarded, that doesn't really like to open himself up to who he really is, and kind of setting that tone of this Mr. McMahon series of, you know, what is the character and who is the real human being. And it kind of puts the illusion out there already that maybe even Vince McMahon doesn't even know who he is, because he's just so guarded about what he wants out there in the public. And so it was interesting, you know, some of the stuff that they went into when it comes to his background, his upbringing, the relationship with his father, and you know, it was really good. I thought it did a real good job of laying down the groundwork rather of what kind of made Vince McMahon coming up before eventually, and we'll talk about it here, purchasing the WWF from his father.
Well, yeah, I thought that was, you know, probably the most interesting part to me of, you know, I think for a lot of people who follow wrestling passionately, there wasn't a ton in this episode number 1 that you didn't really know. But I did think that selling the business and Vince taking over, and him making it seem like making these payments were kind of the end all be all of, nobody thought he possibly was going to make the payments. And then, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Linda McMahon say, didn't she say that basically it was profits for a year?
Yes. They would take the profits from the WWF at that time, or rather, no, they rebranded WWF at that time, and essentially use those profits to kind of put it back so that they can make those payments. And when you think about that territory as well, the New York territory, arguably the biggest territory in all the states at that time, I believe the estimates around that time were they were making $10 million, and so they had to make payments so that they could get it for $250,000. And you think about those gates that they make at MSG, it was it wasn't exactly too difficult to be able to make those payments.
Well, exactly. They kind of made it seem like, how in the world is he ever going to be able to make these payments? Like, that's how Vince made it seem. And it was really surprising. His dad was floored when he made the payments. I'm like, really?
Yeah. And that also too, like, it kind of goes back to Vince McMahon, where he's always wanted to get this portrayal of how he wants to get other people to think about how he wants to be viewed. You know what I mean? So he wants people to view him as a self-made billionaire, a guy who made it on his own and was able to get through the hardships. And he was always somebody throughout his time in the WWF that has tried to make himself be the guy that's fighting back and is always coming up from underneath. And we'll likely see that as well with the other episodes of this Netflix documentary series about that sort of mentality with him, where he has this mindset where it's like, oh, it's me against the world. Obviously, he has his famous feud with Ted Turner, where he's like, oh, I'm going to fight back against Ted Turner. It kind of goes back to, how much of what Vince is saying can you really trust?
Yeah.
And how much of what Vince is saying is just him. And even too, like, they talk about it with, the formation of WrestleMania, in terms of trying to put it all together. How much has that been, a lie that's been repeated for so many years that eventually these wrestlers and these people that, they're in the profession of lying, let's just call it how it is, they just kind of lie so much that they eventually believe that lie, that like it's second nature. So that's, and again, I think it goes back to how the documentary set him up in the shots that they did, and kind of put that sort of emphasis in saying, look, he's going to say stuff and there's going to be stuff you'll probably believe, but he's also a guy that, he's willing to craft his own narrative to what he feels could be beneficial to him. And that's just something we've seen from him throughout his career as a promoter.
I think this is the biggest questions for me that I didn't get answered. Like, I wanted this to be a little bit more, if you were going to set up who Vince McMahon was. You mentioned it earlier. So they didn't really talk about the stepfather. They didn't really talk about, like, his wife at all. Like, she was in it.
Yep.
But there was no real background on how they got together. Like, what happened to the first 12 years of why he didn't see his dad?
Yeah.
I have no idea why.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that there was some, look, I people want blood when this kind of stuff happens. And so they want every detail on every bad thing that's ever happened. And would I like to know a little bit more about, I don't know, the Rita Chatterton stuff, or this crazy thing with the Fabulous Moolah, who might have been the worst person in the world? Or, like, yes, those are all things I'd like to know more about. But if you're going to do a documentary on Vince McMahon, please tell us who Vince McMahon was as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And if he's not going to tell you, go find out.
Yeah. Search out those people.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was a little bit disappointed in that, but I also had to hear how Hulk Hogan called his own match.
Oh yeah.
How Hulk Hogan, hey hey, Hulk, and I know this isn't a Hulk Hogan thing, but hey, Hulk, if you were the one calling that match, the match that you guys never talked about before, because that's not how pro wrestlers do it, brother, in really the biggest changing of the guard from Backlund to the Sheik to you, if you didn't even talk about it before, and then you came up with, quite frankly, it was an absolutely terrible match.
It was. It's really bad.
Right? Like,
yes.
For a world title change to strap the belt to Hogan, it's a terrible match. It's just about Hogan taking off and everyone being behind him. But how they got there and him bragging about it on this, like, oh, I had to call the match, brother, and like, oh my God. But I just wanted to know more about Vince McMahon, and I thought that there were a lot of things left out. And again, not to belabor the point, but it's like, if he's not going to tell you, he's not the only one that can find these things out.
Yeah.
But I think, and I probably should have started with this, but I think it's an interesting topic here as we sort of get into some of the episodes as an overarching angle to this is, Bill Simmons is producing this, and, we've heard stories allegedly of Vince McMahon trying to reach out to buy this documentary back so it didn't air, and Netflix telling him to go shove himself. But how much does Netflix want to bury Vince McMahon in this, knowing that Raw and the WWE, I know it's not Vince McMahon, but the WWE is coming to Netflix in 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
How much do they want to actually do that? There's a real balance there, right? Because they're not going to just make Vince out to be like this sympathetic figure the entire time. But how much do they want to tell the truth for all of these bad things and run the company down? Run it down as much as possible. Oh, but here's our new product in January, and basically, if you're tuning in, yeah, Vince McMahon, it doesn't have anything to do with it now, but he is the reason, and everyone still thinks he kind of does.
Yeah. And one of the things too with that you kind of worry about is because my concern kind of going in was, were they actually going to go hard on Vince but not hard enough on the company itself for allowing what Vince was able to do within the company, you know what I mean? And kind of what you were talking about, where they have this upcoming deal where in the States, Raw is going to Netflix, across internationally, including here in Canada, all the WWE programming is going to Netflix. So how are they going to be able to balance that? And I will say, with everything that we had heard, as you mentioned, with the reporting of Vince trying to buy the DVD back, rather the documentary back, and make sure it doesn't make it to air, and what we saw here, there was definitely stuff that didn't make Vince look that great to start off with his first episode, but I didn't think it was anything that was, earth-shattering or an expose or anything like that, or something that would make him look like the ultimate worst person, deliberately edited the way that he was kind of laying it out. They did talk about, some of the lawsuits in this episode when the WWF was really starting to get popular. They talk about, the John Stossel incident. They talk about the Richard Belzer incident as well, where Hogan choked out Belzer on TV. So there's stuff here that obviously it doesn't paint Vince in the greatest of light. And to kind of go back to what you were saying about the childhood thing as well, one thing I will say when it comes to looking in depth and trying to understand his childhood, where is you could make the argument because, they were gone so long, and Vince kind of made note that, he saw his father, and his father kind of gave like a light pat on the back and said, all right, let's go. And him never asking about what happened, like, that's something you could believe, where he legitimately will never know why his father came back. So, because I know that Vince's mother has also passed away since then as well, so she would not be able to provide that information on what sort of happened with that sort of relationship. But Yeah, it's I would have also liked to have seen that too, where they could have gone a little bit deeper, because I think it is a part of the story that I think fans would want to know a little bit more about, and and again, it goes back into the psyche of Vince McMahon and how he was raised and how he kind of grew up into this person that we know him as today. So a lot of elements there.
I think the other thing that bothered me a little bit, knowing a lot about the business, I know more of the story than this documentary told us, but you keep hearing, and you hear it a lot when you hear about the early days of the WWF. Everything was riding on WrestleMania. If WrestleMania was going to be successful, and if it wasn't going to be successful, maybe we wouldn't have the company today. You keep hearing those lines, right?
Yep.
And they explained a little bit that he took mortgages out, but I don't know. I just think that you're running this business. You've bought the business. You're running this. I want to know more about why that show was so important and what you actually would have lost. Like, it's really great to say all of these things, and I'm sure some of them are true. I'm not doubting that. I just don't know what would have really, would the company have gone under, and tell us why it would have gone under if this show was not profitable.
Yeah.
And I didn't find those answers out. I kept hearing a lot of people say, well, if this show didn't work, then, it could have ruined the company. Okay. I'm going to believe you. Tell me why.
Yeah.
But you didn't tell me why. You just kept telling me that maybe the company's going to go under, or we're in huge trouble. Okay, well, that doesn't really mean anything to me. And it goes back, and I think we'll sort of end here, Zach, on what, for episode 1, what I got out of this, and maybe you can finish with what you got out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you said it perfectly. I came into this documentary series thinking I'm not going to believe a lot of what Vince McMahon says. I'm going to believe what some other people say, probably, and that have more integrity, but I'm probably not going to believe a lot about what he says. And I left episode 1 going, okay, well, here's a background on Vince McMahon, and there's not a lot of other people telling me about his childhood or his stepfather or the abuse or why WrestleMania 1 was so important. It was just him saying all of these things, and I kind of don't believe when he speaks. And I needed a little bit more from the accompaniment around him in episode 1, because now I'm going in going, okay, well, I don't really believe a lot of what you have to say, and now that's my attitude as I head into episode number 2 this week.
Yeah, there was stuff that I'm glad they touched on, but I wish they would have gone deeper into when it came to episode 1. There were some interesting things. I want to kind of hear your thought quickly, because I didn't know this before until they said it on the doc, but apparently they were considering Dusty Rhodes to be, if Hogan didn't work out in terms of being a lead babyface, to kind of take them into this new era. Part of me just doesn't really believe that, to be quite honest.
Well, I think, to be fair, and maybe I'm confusing it, it was more that, I think they were considering Dusty before they went to Hogan.
Right.
And it was, okay, well, who can we get, that's going to be able to take us to the next level? And Dusty Rhodes was a more established name than Hogan at that point. But, kind of representing that he didn't really step up to the opportunity. And look, we talk a lot of wonderful things about Dusty Rhodes, but he was not a perfect person either, by a long shot. And so, did he actually step up? Not step up? Did they give him a chance to do that? Was there something that happened beforehand that they said we need to go in a different direction? Like, Dusty was not the easiest person to work with.
Yep. Especially as a booker too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you hear that from a lot of people. Now, I don't know either whether, son of a plumber, and I think when I think of Vince McMahon and his history, he always went back. And I think as you saw this as the evolution of the WWF at the time came through, his biggest stars that he loved, that he pushed, that he wanted out there, first of all, were a little bit of the circus freaks, but they were really, really big men that were in shape.
Yeah.
Hogan, Warrior,
Savage to an extent.
Savage to an extent. The people who he pushed to the moon, and later on, Cena. I just don't know that Vince was behind. He wanted to push Luger as the narcissist bodybuilder WBF guy.
Yep.
Like, it was just, yeah, he had some circus freaks in there, and then the Bundys and the Studs and Andre the Giant, obviously, and like he looked at it as more of a circus. But the people that he really wanted to push to the moon were always really big guys that were in shape and cut and ripped and all those things. And Dusty was none of those things.
Yeah.
So do I believe it? Not really.
And plus too, his son is in the company in a top position, right? Like that could also be a benefit to them to say, oh, the lineage of all these top stars, and now we've got his son, and we wanted his father to be a big star, and now his son's a big star. Put that in the mindset as well.
It fits the mold, whether it's the truth or not.
Exactly. So I thought that was interesting. I didn't believe it. Like I've known that there were backup plans in case Hogan wasn't going to be the guy, but obviously coming out of Rocky 3, like you had to go with Hogan if you want to do national expansion. Just take advantage of Vern Gagne just refusing to push the most popular guy in wrestling in the AWA. And we've heard stories of other guys, like Kerry Von Erich is another name that's been talked about as being part of the push, but he never had Hogan's talking ability. Like, he had the look and obviously had that crowd connection there in Texas, but he was never going to be that main face of the WWF. But he was somebody that was considered as a potential backup. And, there's some talk about, maybe in the future, if they couldn't get Hogan or Kerry Von Erich, that you go to an established guy like they were mentioning Dusty Rhodes. There was some inklings of potentially trying to lure Ric Flair to the WWF if Hogan wasn't there. But again, we know how the history goes. In terms of the overall episode 1, I was kind of going into this series with reserved expectations. Because of that Netflix deal that WWE has and where they were going to go and what they were going to cover. And I will say, in this first episode, there was stuff that I was glad that they covered. I wish they could go a little bit deeper onto stuff because of the way that they angled it, this show, where it's like, oh, we're going to look into the psyche of Vince McMahon and understand his thought process. And there were a lot of times it's like, oh, we're going through this period in history and we're going to this period in history and let's talk about the territories and, the stuff that a wrestling fan like you and I is going to know already, but is going to try and appeal to that mass Netflix audience to try and get them to understand what's going on. And they talked about the lawsuits. They talk about, the Janelle Grant lawsuit at the start, and where, they talk about how there's been delays in the process for this documentary, and then going back into the interviews that they recorded in the early 2020s. So they set up some good stuff. One of the things that this documentary already has an advantage over on Death of WCW is a historian like Dave Meltzer on here to kind of fact check and make sure everything was going at a right pace and kind of being sort of a, for lack of a better term, a gatekeeper of information and just kind of making things straightforward that the Death of WCW, or rather Who Killed WCW, did not have. So I was glad to see Dave was in there. There was good stuff here. There are definitely story beats that if you're a casual fan, even if you're a casual wrestling fan, you kind of already know these story beats, the way that it goes. But in terms of the first episode, the way that was put together and how it was edited, it was a strong start to the series, and it got me interested in seeing, okay, where are they going to go next from here? Because they set up all the stuff afterwards. They show the stuff with the Ring Boy scandal. They show the stuff with Rita Chatterton and the steroid stuff. So it kind of set up that pace, and and set up for what the second episode will be. So it'll make it interesting to see where they go with this series after this first episode.
The last thought is something, again, that you said, but really stuck with me. They began this whole documentary with Vince McMahon saying, well, I'm not going to tell you the good stuff. I think that this is going to be a microcosm for this whole series. So we'll see how that goes. But there is a little bit on episode 1, Junior, of Mr. McMahon on Netflix. Episode 1 was basically a background check and catching people up on who Vince McMahon was and how he got to, where he needed to get to. And now we start in with, I think, a little bit more of the details of some of the things that went on in Heat, as the episode was named. Yes, there's always heat around Vince McMahon.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so as episode 1 left off, they were kind of, we're going to take off into the late 80s, early 90s, and the steroid trial, and where Vince McMahon, and I think I told you off the air, it's like I can't get out of my mind that I want this to be about Vince McMahon and not about somebody else. But
Yes.
I will try my best to stay on course here. I do think that one of the big changes from where the WWE was, or the WWF at the time, and some of the stars, like, the King Kong Bundys, and it started to turn into the juice freaks.
Yeah.
And really, like, how do we want to be presented? We want to be presented with, people like the WBF, and people that are like this ungodly fascination that Vince McMahon had with bodybuilding and everything else. Maybe let's just start there, Zach, and the change that the wrestling company underwent because of the fact that the owner wanted to change the look illegally of where that company was going.
Yeah, it was big in the late 80s, early 90s. You had steroids becoming a much more prominent talking point. Around that time, what's the football player's name? Lyle Alzado, I think his name was, who played for the Raiders. He was a big face of what steroids could be. That I remember, hearing some information about that. And so you had more information about what steroids could do to the body. And essentially all of these leagues, including the WWF, implementing a steroid policy of sorts. And eventually it led to the steroid trial. They talked a little bit about it in the episode where they charged Dr. George Zahorian, who was actually on some of the WWF shows as the ringside doctor. And he was accused of distributing steroids to the wrestlers. And through there, the federal government, the feds, were trying to see if they could find a way to implicate Vince McMahon as him being a distributor, to try and encourage his wrestlers to get on steroids, giving wrestlers steroids so that they could have the looks that Vince would ascribe to, and what he feels the vision and how pro wrestling should look is all these, as you kind of mentioned, juiced up freaks, these muscled up, roided up guys on their television screen. And they touched on it here in the episode when it came to the steroid stuff. They talked about how Hogan lied. What a shocker. On Arsenio.
Let's just stop here. You have brought his name up before me, and I just want that to be on record.
That's right.
That I was not the first one to bring his name up.
No.
He does come up a lot in this episode, for sure.
And he is in the sense of the steroid stuff. He is a key figure in the steroid trial because it was starting to bubble up, and there was talk about Hogan using steroids, and they were the image that the WWF wanted to portray with Hogan is like he's this clean-cut All-American, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, maybe eat your vitamins a little too seriously on that in that case. But, and now there's this whole image issue, and Vince telling Hogan to go on Arsenio Hall and just tell the truth and say, look, I took steroids. I'm not going to take steroids anymore, and just move on forward. But instead, Hogan, for whatever reason, decided not to do that, said he only took steroids 2 or 3 times in the early 80s, and it just kind of blew up from there. And from that steroid trial, that steroid scandal, you also had the other scandals that kind of ballooned up as well that I think have become, I would argue, bigger issues with the WWF than steroids. In the case of the Ring Boy scandal, they touched on that a little bit. They mentioned Tom Cole. They showed a news clip of him interviewing a local station. They also mentioned the Rita Chatterton stuff, which I will mention something that Vince said that just kind of blew me away, the way that he said it. But it was really around that time, they call it Titan Gate because of all the different scandals, not just steroids, but the Ring Boys, and you have the sex assault allegation from Rita Chatterton. All of that kind of bubbling to the surface in this company after, Hogan was still drawing to a high level, but they were looking to try and find that next guy. They mentioned it with Ultimate Warrior and other guys, but really especially that early 90s period is when the WWF really faced a lot of controversy for, it might be the light word of in this case, but a lot of scandals plaguing this company.
So, look, I don't believe a lot of what Vince McMahon or Hulk Hogan ever say. So it's hard for me to take sometimes when it looks like they're telling the truth. I guess I'll ask you, do you really believe that Vince McMahon told Hulk Hogan on Arsenio Hall to just go and tell the truth?
I actually do believe that. Just based on researching, what Dave and other, writers at the time were talking about. I do believe that he, with the way that the things were surfacing up and Vince saying, look, it's not going to get better. We need to just kind of commit and move forward. Because really, if all eyes were on the WWF at that point in terms of what their steroid use was in the company. And I think if they just embraced it and said, look, we're trying to move forward. This was what our company used to be. We're trying to move forward. I do think that's what Vince told Hogan. And I think Hogan, again, for whatever reason, decided, I'm just going to, whether he just didn't want to own up to his steroid usage or whatever, he just did not go on Arsenio and tell the truth. Because when you really look at it, from that point, you can point a lot of what happened when it came to the FBI investigating and the trial itself, going back to that Arsenio moment. And I don't think the FBI and the feds would have been on the WWF at that as much, if at all, if they just admitted, look, we had steroids, we're implementing a policy, because historically, and we continue to see it here today, we'll talk about it in this series, but wrestling will kind of get slight slaps on the wrist from in terms of media coverage and scrutiny and how it's kind of looked at, because at the end of the day, pro wrestling is looked at, it's this silly little thing that people like to watch. And through that, I think that's also because of that lens being in place, in my personal opinion, how Vince was able to get away with so much stuff, because he didn't have that scrutiny. He didn't have that, that look from the outside, the mainstream media, for lack of a better term, to be scrutinized and look at the decision making that he made when it came to the WWF. So with the sensing pressure when it came to that and more of the national scrutiny on them, I do believe he wanted to do that because of everything that kind of came after that point.
Okay, a couple other things here I want to get to, and this union stuff with Jesse the Body Ventura, a whole bunch of people kind of jumping on board, and Hulk Hogan going and, ratting out everybody, saying that they were stirring up crap. And it was basically Vince and Hogan against everybody else. My question to you is, Do you think if Hogan didn't do that, that it still, like, would it have happened? Or, as they alluded to in the episode, these things are very difficult to get off the ground no matter what, because there's always somebody that says, oh, yeah, I'll do it. And then at the very end, they will jump ship because they will get a better spot because they've leapt ahead of a whole bunch of people that are going to sit out for the better good. Do you think it would have happened and they could have formed a union if Hulk Hogan didn't do that?
Man, it's tough to say. I certainly do think that that was the best chance that wrestling will ever have when it comes to a union. I still firmly believe we'll never see a union in pro wrestling, even though there should be, quite frankly. That was certainly the best chance with the rise of the popularity of the WWF and becoming national. And they mentioned it on on this episode as well, the amount of dates that were being worked by these wrestlers. And so this would have been close, but kind of knowing how wrestlers are, and if it wasn't going to be Hogan, I feel like it would have been somebody else in the process in terms of shutting it down and making any sort of progress. It's tough to say because you hear it at the time, and Jesse Ventura has mentioned it too. He had some support from people in the back saying, "Hey, let's put a union together. Let's help ourselves here so that we can get at least a better chunk of what's going on." But as it kind of mentioned, and I was surprised he even admitted it on the show, but Hogan kind of stooging them out and saying, "Yeah, there's a union being put together here. We have to stamp this out here." And not too surprising considering Hogan was the top guy at that point, and so that would mean maybe a little bit less of a check going his way. But yeah, I have a tough time believing that a union would get through just based on the nature of the wrestling business and how wrestlers are. I certainly think that was the best chance they could have had.
Right.
But I just, it's tough for me to say, yes, a union would have happened at that point. I certainly think it would have gotten gotten pretty far, but I don't think they would have crossed the finish line.
Yeah, my take is very simple on this. If you didn't have Hogan on your side for the union, it wouldn't have worked no matter how many people you had.
Yeah.
Because if Hogan and Vince are on one side and Hulk Hogan really is the guy, as much as we talk, I talk a little trash about him, and so do you, but because he's a terrible human being. He wanted his cut, and his cut was going to be less if that happened. And that didn't matter to him. It was more that Hogan was either going to be a good person and stand up for others or going to be selfish. But if he was on the selfish side, he was the guy that drew all the money. And as much as I don't like him, if he was working a card, you would draw money. If he wasn't working a card, you wouldn't draw any money. And it was that simple.
Yeah.
So if you didn't have that guy on your side, that guy was the difference. If he was full union, wanted to make a difference in the height of Hulkamania, going on Saturday night's main event, NBC, network television, if Hulk Hogan wanted a union, I think he probably could have got it at that point. But he wasn't on your side. I don't care how many people were there, because we always make a joke about how guys are so hot or they're so good that they could wrestle a broomstick. I'm pretty sure Hogan did wrestle a bunch of guys that were like broomsticks. It didn't matter. People wanted to go. They wanted to see Hulkamania. They wanted to hear Real American. They wanted to see him rip off his t-shirt. They wanted to see him get his ass kicked for 7 minutes. Hulk up, boot, leg, it's over. Pose. Eat your vitamins. Say your prayers. That's what people wanted. And it really, honestly, how many people do you think he was in the ring with from winning the title in 84 to losing the title for a bit in 88? until he won it back in 89.
Yep.
Like, how many people do you think he was in the ring with legitimately from when he lost the title, when he couldn't even lose the title, right? It was up for grabs and he didn't really get pinned and double referees and all that stuff. Like,
right.
It's Hogan loses the title after 4 years without having his shoulders to the mat. What a shocker. But how many people in there would you think, you know what? That was a really good wrestler.
It's very few. The first one that came to mind was Savage.
Yeah, but I'm kind of talking, when I said that, I should have like specifically said before the Savage stuff, because Savage came in, he wrestled Hogan a couple of times, but not even in like you would go to the Spectrum in Philadelphia and Hogan and Savage would wrestle.
Yep.
But it wasn't like a major feud that culminated in anything until WrestleMania 5. And, you know, the Mega Powers and everything else. But I'm talking about before that. So like 84 to 88, when Hogan lost the title. How many guys were in a feud with Hogan that was like a big feud that culminated at a pay-per-view? That, like, I'm going through the list and it's like, okay, well, there's Bundy and, you know, the big lead up to Andre the Giant that was a spectacle that isn't really completely overshadowed by Savage and Steamboat, but, you know, and then them lying to the crowd about everything. That's one of the things that bothers me about this episode a lot, that sort of gets overlooked. They talked about it a little bit in the 93,000 that was really 78,000.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big difference when you're setting indoor record crowds and lying about it. When 15,000 people is not that's a full arena. That's a sold out show in Ottawa.
Yep.
So that's a lot of people that you're not counting.
Yeah.
And then also, like, on, like, just the lies of, like, Andre's never been slammed and Andre's never been beaten. And, like, what are you talking about?
Even in this, they were like, and Pat LaPrade, who's been a guest on our show before, was even kind of, you know, pounding the desk on this, but they mentioned, like he had to have back surgery before the match. He actually had back surgery after the WrestleMania 3 match, like stuff like that, you know? So it was all that stuff. And like you mentioned, they touched on the attendance mark, and this is one of the strengths so far of the series as we're watching through, is these cutaways that they do. Where it's like, Pritchard's saying 93,000, Hogan's saying 93,000, Vince is saying 93,000, and Dave's just like, yeah, it was actually 78,000 people in the building. Like, it was a really well done cut there. It was that's kind of the wrestling business, unfortunately. And I didn't really like that one journalist guy there, Shoemaker, that was like, well, you know, what's it matter what the real number is? It's all about the magic and blah 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 of the moment and whatnot. It's like, no, if you're a journalist, it's actually kind of important to be correct on this sort of stuff. I get where you're coming from if you were saying it as a fan, but as a journalist, I kind of disagreed with what he said there.
Reporting facts.
Yeah, I feel like that's a simple thing. As someone that does journalism here, I feel like that's a simple thing, but apparently not, according to Shoemaker. That
you should go on CJBQ and just spew out a bunch of facts about polls, about voting, and how this person has a 94% lead, and then people will be, Zach, that's not true. Well, what do the numbers really matter?
He won anyway. Yeah,
it's about the magic. Like, no, it's not.
No, like, don't say that.
So yeah, they lied a bunch. But my point is that Hogan didn't even wrestle anybody any good.
No,
like, he was never in big feuds with anybody that could actually wrestle. And the only guy that was, as you said, was Savage, who did fight him sometimes, but it was never like really on TV in a big feud until after when Savage won the title as a babyface, and then the two exploded, and then had the WrestleMania 5 match after the Mega Powers exploded. And I mean, anyway, it was just a bunch of lies. But Hogan, if you didn't have Hogan drew money with going out and fighting King Kong Bundy or Big John Studd or Andre the Giant and Kamala and like all of these people that are just terrible, terrible matches. But it doesn't matter. So if you didn't have Hogan, you weren't getting that.
Yeah. And that wasn't the kind of match that Hogan was kind of built on when it came to his stardom. It wasn't based on having these great matches with other wrestlers. It was based on, oh my God, he's going against this giant of a man. Can Hogan overcome this giant of a man? And like Andre, you know, as you mentioned, Kamala and all these other guys, King Kong Bundy, can he overcome the odds and beat this guy? So the only other one, and this wasn't necessarily for pay-per-view, but it kind of popped in my head, was Hogan and Orndorff at the big event in Toronto.
Yeah, which I was at.
Which you were at, and that drew a huge crowd. Not pay-per-view, but still.
Exhibition Stadium.
Yeah.
I want to say 1986.
Yep.
Massive crowd. I was deep in the standing room or on the floor, but couldn't see a thing. And again, I was only 10 or 11 or whatever I was, and I have the ticket still somewhere, but I don't remember very much of it, other than like sort of the entrances, but I don't remember specifics. But I was definitely there because my biggest memory of the whole event is that I couldn't see. But anyway, you're right. There was that one. It was straight to Coliseum Video.
Yeah. And that drew a big crowd too. 60,000 people is what they say.
Yeah, I just knew there were a lot of people there. I would have to look up what it was. I do want to get into a little bit before we go here, though, of, you know, sort of getting into not only you mentioned the Rita Chatterton stuff, and you know, you see a lot of these big mistakes to me were self-inflicted by this company, which is like really odd, right? Like Hogan goes on Arsenio Hall, and whether he went into business for himself or whatever happened there, he was made to look like an idiot. And then Vince McMahon going on Phil Donahue. Like, what in the world are you doing going on like basically Phil Donahue was a light Jerry Springer before Jerry Springer.
Yep.
What are you doing going on that show with a whole bunch of other people that can refute? I'm interested to hear your take on that, because it sort of leads into, you know, a little bit of the Rita Chatterton stuff and her going on Geraldo. And I don't know why people didn't believe her or didn't give her credit, or I don't know why it didn't hit more with people.
If what you just said right there is how I feel a lot of times with some of WWF scandals in general, when it comes to why it didn't really hit more. Yeah, in the case of, you know, going on that show, Phil Donahue, and that was a lot of guests on there. It wasn't just, you know, Vince. It was also superstar Billy Graham was on that show. Dave Meltzer, John Arezzi, who was a guest on our show in the past, was on that show. So there was a lot of people on there. And I specifically remember they talked with one of the former announcers on that show. I believe his name was Murray Hodgson. And he was, you know, explicitly he was going right at Vince. Like, you go back and you watch that and you think, man, this guy, like, he's taking Vince to task here on this show, and he's countering him, and Vince was saying Murray was a bad, announcer, and Murray's countering back saying, no, you actually had me do this and increase my roles. And since then I wouldn't do favors for one of your executives, then you let me go. And the crazy part about all of that when it came to the Murray Hodgson stuff is that eventually he got dropped by his lawyer because his lawyer said he was a lifelong con man. And he had in the past gone to other companies and accused their executives of misconduct because they were gay. And so you kind of watch that and you hear that from that lawyer and you think to yourself, man, like, he was very convincing, I could tell you that, when it came to the way that he was going after Vince. But it's been kind of Vince's MO, and I believe they'll talk about it in future episodes as well. It's like Vince's, even with this documentary, in terms of looking at his life, he feels like this is stuff that he could take on and he can be at the face of it. And a lot of that is ego. And we've seen that with Vince for so long, where he has this feeling of invincibility. And certainly after the steroid trial, where he beats the federal government in court. And when you look at that case, when it comes to the feds, it was such a weakly put together case. And they tried to get Hogan to be their star witness. And they kind of mentioned that, and I think Dave also revealed it on his show too, that the reason why Hogan got immunity and why he was a star witness for the feds was because the feds had something on him about him distributing steroids to other wrestlers. So in order to try and get Vince, they granted Hogan immunity so that he could speak. And little did they know it would backfire on them when Hogan, under oath, said that Vince never went around and distributed steroids and was not like personally selling steroids. And that kind of made the whole federal government's case fall apart. It helped make it helped give Vince this invincibility complex where he's like, well, I could beat the federal government, I could beat anybody. And his lawyer has consistently talked about how that was kind of his landmark defining case. And so yeah, there's all that stuff. And then as you mentioned with the Rita Chatterton deal, they talked about the incident in the limo back in 1986 when she was a referee for the WWF. And she brought it forward in 1992, saying she didn't want to have her parents, who were ill at that time, kind of go through what was going on with her, and didn't want to put her through that sort of public spotlight. And then, so once her parents passed away, then she moved forward with the accusations against Vince. And what Vince said on that show about, in the documentary, about how everything was consensual, blah, blah, blah. One reasonable person would just stop right there in terms of addressing the allegation. But then, of course, it's Vince, so he had to keep going. And then him saying, and if it was a rape, it would be out of the statute of limitations, so it wouldn't matter anymore, or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing there. But when he said that, I was like, geez, like that. If there was anybody that was still kind of on the edge, I don't know how you can listen to that and think, man, this is an innocent man I'm looking at right there. In my personal view. So I saw that at the doc. That was one of those things that kind of blew me away in the documentary. Is that Vince would just say that. But again, it goes back to ego and thinking you're invincible and thinking, well, this is stuff in the past and I want to get this documentary done and I don't care, like, do a thing on my life at that time. So yeah, there was a lot of that stuff touched on.
Well, and to end, I think, Zach, you said that perfectly. There's no way you could watch that clip and go, oh yeah, that's an innocent guy. I mean, that's my opinion as well.
Yeah.
But let's just even say that that's not true. Like that he was telling the truth. Very end of the episode, they put up a little graphic as the episode is ending, saying in 2023, during a temporary lift of those statute of limitations for alleged victims of sexual offense in New York State, Vince McMahon paid $1 million settlement to Rita Chatterton.
Very quickly, too.
Like, the second that there was a temporary lift, it was like, oh boy, better take care of this quickly.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound so innocent to me.
No. Yeah, it kind of really sums it up, in terms of how that goes. And yeah, just kind of wrapping things up here, just to kind of get some quick bullet points in. I thought episode 2. So I will peek back behind the curtain here and say I've gone ahead and watched the rest of the episodes in
Which
preparation
I
for this.
not.
So I won't spoil anything or anything like that. I just want to put that in there, and I will say that this was my favorite episode of the documentary series. And even then, I wish they would have delved deeper into stuff. It kind of felt like, hey, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And I was hoping for a little bit more deep dive analysis on this stuff, especially with the way that this series is spread out. I'm glad stuff was mentioned. Like, I'm glad they mentioned Tom Cole and the Ring Boy stuff. I wish they would have mentioned more about how Vince had fired Mel Phillips, but then brought him back into the company on the grounds that he stay away from children, despite it previously being known that he was, he described his relationship with children as, quote, peculiar. Like, I wish they would have delved deep into that, and they showed the article from there that had that quote in the documentary, but they didn't mention it in the documentary itself. So I wish they could have dived a little bit deeper on that sort of stuff when it came to, Phillips and Garvin and Patterson, in terms of how they got, let go. I know they touched on Patterson a lot, and Patterson is always somebody that's kind of murky when it comes to his involvement on things because of, there have been accusations against him that were then rescinded, but there are also still accusations like from Tom Cole that are still, I find, very verifiable and at least something to be looked at. And they had Tony Atlas, make an accusation against Patterson as well. So I wish they could have gone deeper into that sort of realm. And they touched on the Snuka stuff for like 2 minutes. And I was like, man, there's more you could do with the Snuka. That's a whole episode you could do with the Snuka stuff. Yeah. Like Snuka.
And if you want to see that episode, Dark Side of the Ring,
yes,
has a lot more on that Snuka stuff.
So there's stuff I wish they could have dove deeper on and mentioned, like even Snuka said in his book that Vince showed up to the police station with a briefcase, and then when he left, Vince didn't have that briefcase anymore. Like stuff like that. And just kind of dive deeper, because I think that's what a Netflix audience would want, especially with all the different documentaries that they have, those true crime documentaries. Having said that, though, there was stuff that they touched on that I'm glad that they touched on, and I was going in with some concerns because I thought they wouldn't touch on it. And so I'm glad that they spoke about it. I just wish they would have went a little bit more in depth on it, as opposed to, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Like, you could have cut out stuff like, I didn't need to know about WrestleMania 2 in this episode. Like, that could have been cut out because it really didn't relate back to Vince. I wish they could have dived deeper into some of the scandals and whatnot in those early 90s, because those were pivotal years for Vince and that company in terms of them being formed and how it kind of got them through.
Episode 2, Heat, of the Vince McMahon Netflix documentary. For those who don't know, you're living in a hole because I talk about it too much. But I was at Survivor Series 1997. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Montreal. In fact, I did the whole circuit that weekend of Survivor Series in Montreal, Raw in Ottawa, and then Raw again taped the next night in Cornwall. So quite an interesting time with the internet in 1997. I can tell you it's not 2024 with the internet.
Yes.
A little bit different in those times. In fact, a lot different. Couldn't really do a whole lot on the internet. DOS was a big thing. Minutes and minutes and minutes of waiting for something to load. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
But also, I feel like I have leaned into the Montreal screw job, and between Wrestling with Shadows, the Bret Hart documentary, and every single thing between Crave series, that there's just so many people that have dove into the screw job, and that ended up being kind of more the end of this, which to me paints Vince McMahon in some sort of light. But I thought the beginning of episode 3, Screwjob, where it didn't really have a lot to do with the Screwjob, was much more salacious would be the wrong word, but there was more information and things that I got out of it. And then we got to the Screwjob, and it's like, I know that story. I didn't really learn anything. It's interesting still to hear some of the people talk about it, but I think when you watch this episode, it's called The Screwjob. They spend the last, 20 minutes on the Screwjob. I actually thought the first half of this show was more interesting, and I'm going to ask you about that right now. So, Zach, when I watch television and I'm interested in something, I'm not a big guy to write things down. But what I will do is sort of pause the show, as we have that luxury in today's 2024, and I will go back and just sort of go, okay, what was that? Whether it's a live hockey game, a live sporting event, a tape show, and just kind of rewind it and let it play again. And for me, that second time, it really sinks in to, okay, that's what I thought I heard, and I'm processing it now. And this happened to me twice in the first 30 minutes of this program, which it hasn't happened yet. So I'm just super interested on your take on this, because the first half of this program, some of it had to do with the rating of the territories by Vince McMahon, and then the unfair, unjust way that poor family-run owned Vince McMahon business was being attacked by billionaire Ted. Just your thoughts on that in general, as far as knowing the story, Vince positioning himself as this kind of homegrown, family-run, local business that was being taken advantage of by the big billionaire in Ted Turner.
Yeah, it was. They kind of pointed that out as well, and it's kind of funny with Vince, where he's been kind of insulated for so long in his own, for lack of a better term, universe, that when he gets pressed on it, when it comes to, well, if you complain about the treatment you got when you were trying to compete with Ted, but isn't that the exact same thing that you did with the territories? And Vince straight up admitted that it's like, hey, it might seem hypocritical, but, I'm just going to, sometimes people don't even really know what I'm going to say. And
right. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm going to stop you, because this is what I actually rewound to write down word for word his response, because I was blown away. Even for Vince McMahon, I was blown away. So to that exact point, and this is where I thought the documentary did a pretty good job, was like, they set up in episode 1 the background and the history. While some, it wasn't all that interesting, or they knew some of the story, this was Vince McMahon's idea to bring, rightly or wrongly, the local promotions, the regional promotions, into a national audience. And to do that, he had to pick off one by one all of the people that his dad was friends with, and he picked those people off one by one. And I mean, you just look at the names, from Hogan to Greg the Hammer Valentine to the Junkyard Dog to Paul Orndorff,
Roddy Piper.
Roddy Piper, yeah, great example. So all of his top stars in the 80s, this was not a homegrown thing. It was, I'm not only going to go around and pick out your best people, but by doing that, I'm going to put you out of business. And then 10 years later, somebody picked off a couple of people. And this is what Zach, I'm sorry, I'm just really worked up about this, because if you are dumb enough and I don't want to give Hogan any credit whatsoever, and I'm not going to, but if you are dumb enough to have a handshake deal with somebody that literally for 10 years put the company on their back, the one part that I don't agree with Hogan in almost anything he ever says, but one thing he said in this documentary was this was a two-way street in episode 3, and like we both did this. Like I know you put me and you put me in the machine, but we've seen that other people can't do that, and Hogan did that. He elevated the business to a level that's never been seen before, maybe never will again. He superseded. People didn't know a wrestler alive, but they knew who Hulk Hogan was. And both of those men, who are not great people in my personal opinion, both of those people were responsible for that. And you let a guy walk out the door and had a handshake deal, no contract, no nothing. And then when you let the Macho Man Randy Savage walk out the door, you could have re-signed Randy Savage. You didn't. Correct?
Correct.
You could have signed Hogan to a deal that said there was a no compete. You went on a handshake, correct?
Correct.
So this whole picking people apart, they didn't even raid your company. You let Lex Luger wrestle on a house show on a Sunday night, which, by the way, they didn't even show the right footage of. They showed him at SummerSlam and not the actual footage.
Yeah,
of him
that was weird. I'm glad somebody else knows that. It's like, shouldn't they have picked something else for that?
Right, like show me the footage of him at the house show on the Sunday night. But he didn't have a contract, and you're mad that he showed up on somebody else's TV the next night with no contract? And by the way, when I say no contract, I mean you shot the guy to the moon, and then you actually pulled the plug. And I think you should have pulled the plug because you were trying to make him into Hogan 2 with the US Express, and literally he was a dud.
Mm-hmm.
And you pulled the plug. But he also, like, Lex Luger to me has never been charismatic, never been that entertaining, but he also was along for that ride. And when he finally got to the culmination of that ride, you didn't give him the title because you didn't think he was good enough. And now that guy doesn't have a contract and you don't expect him to leave? Are you the worst businessman in the world? You're mad that that guy left when you pushed him to the moon, and then at the end you didn't give him the prize? You didn't think that he might be a little pissed off? Whether he deserved the prize or not, again, I agree with Vince. I wouldn't have given it to him either. But how can you be surprised that that guy would leave with no contract? So the words that I wrote down when he was actually being asked about the hypocrisy of him going and picking off every superstar in the regional territories in the 80s and what Ted Turner was doing to him, which to me is not even close to the same thing. He put people out of business all around the country. And all Ted Turner did was take guys that contracts had ended and brought them into his company. He didn't even go cherry picking. What I say sometimes is totally different from what I think. And the public doesn't understand that sometimes. As a businessman, sometimes you have to throw things out there. It's not really the way you feel, but it controls thought process. Are you absolutely out of your mind?
You know what that translates to, Lee?
Tell me, Zach.
Where you're trying to work the marks. That's what his thought process is.
So you're going to say something different than how you actually feel because you want to control everybody's mind. And then when it doesn't work out or you're called on the hypocrisy, you're basically like, you don't understand. You don't get it. No, actually, Vince, We all get it. You don't get it. There are some people, if you can believe this, Vince, that are as smart or even a little bit smarter than you. Can you believe that, Zach?
Shocking. What a shocking revelation.
I can't even believe this statement that you would actually say. Sometimes what I say is different from what I think, and the public doesn't understand that. As a businessman, sometimes you have to throw things out there. It's not really the way you feel, but it controls thought process. I am the best manipulator in the business. I control what you think all the time. Don't call me on it when I'm lying or when I did something exactly the same or worse than you're accusing me of. Don't do that because I control your mind. I couldn't even. I had to take a break and like walk away and just regather myself, Zach.
Well, that's Vince. I mean, like I heard that. I was like, wow, that's incredibly hypocritical. But I'm also, when I heard it, I was like, that sounds like something Vince would say.
I know. Okay, so this is the point that I want to make in this entire episode. I'll give you the rest of the episode. Actually, one more quote, then I'll give you the rest of the episode.
No problem.
But when we say, and we say this about people in life all the time, well, do you expect anything else? That's kind of who they are. This is who he is, but this is why this documentary was made, because he's a horrible person. And somebody who thinks the way that he does. And this is going to continue into the next quote that I have. And I know I'm taking this quote and I'm taking it out of context a little bit. But you tell me how fair it is for me to take it out of context. Because later on in the episode, they were trying to make it seem like, okay, Ted Turner, Vince McMahon, and Eric Bischoff was like, hey, I'm the guy trying to put you out of business, but you never mentioned my name. And then they go back and show Eric Bischoff's audition from 1990 in the WWF. That he tried out to be an announcer. Apparently, Vince doesn't remember that at all. Like, you would run a company and an announcer on your television, you wouldn't know. Vince is the most hands-on micromanager of everything, to the point of what announcers are saying in the middle of matches, but he didn't know that an announcer was trying out for his own company. That's a lie. Okay? That's a lie. Then he was asked about if he regretted, which I thought was an interesting question, if he regretted not hiring Eric Bischoff in 1990. Because it was a leading question, because Eric Bischoff at the time was just another announcer that in no way could you have known that he was going to be hired 4 or 5 years later into a position of authority in the rival company. You couldn't have known that. But his answer to this question, Zach, did you regret not hiring Eric Bischoff in 1990? His answer was, I don't really regret anything that ever happened in my life. Now, he said that. I don't know if he's just meaning that it's about Eric Bischoff, but we're going to find out here shortly. And I have not gone ahead. You have, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about each episode, but there's a lot of bad stuff coming up. I don't really regret anything I ever did in my life. I don't even know what to say to that. I know this is why the documentary is being done, but I didn't even know how you go back from this. Because I am going to take that quote and I know they're talking about Bischoff. So is it fair of me to extrapolate that quote into the other bad things that are coming up here for old Vin when he says, I don't regret anything that ever happened in my life? But they were asking him about Bischoff. Is it fair for me to take it and put it to other people?
I think so. It makes it clear that, it's talked about anything regarding his life, and you kind of put the context back in there about why he made that quote. So I think that's totally fair.
Okay. These are two quotes I can't come back from with him.
Yeah.
Like, I don't. I'm just telling you that I know when we get to the end of this, I'm fired up about other things. I am coming back to these two things, saying these are two things I could not get past. I just can't get past them.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is the horrible human being that he is. So anyway, they go through the kind of poor Vinny being taken over by the billionaire Ted and how Eric Bischoff is in there. And
he tried to angle himself as like, oh, we're running a mom and pop shop over here of professional wrestling, and the big evil billionaire Ted is coming in and taking us over. And they talk about those billionaire Ted skits as well. And there were some interesting things in that part. They had somebody on from the USA Network. They actually had both Bonnie Hammer and I think her the other name was Kelly Kaplowski, I think was her name.
Yep.
And it was Kaplowski, I believe, that mentioned that with the way things were going, that when it came to the steroid trial, and if Vince was convicted, that they would have dropped the WWF, which would have been you want to talk about a changing of history. If that were to happen, if USA drops the WWE, WWF, considering their relationship and NBC Universal relationship with WWE, that could have changed a lot of what we see now when it comes to professional wrestling. I thought it was interesting. I never saw this before, but they showed footage of Ted Turner actually seeing the skits on his seat and laughing.
I had not seen that either.
That was cool. I didn't even know. Like, I had heard he had, it had been reported that he had seen him, but I didn't even realize it was actually taped of him watching the clips and him just laughing about it. I mean, it's Ted Turner, right? Like, he's got other important things to deal with when it comes to his, businessman life, when it comes to running, the Turner networks at that time and the Braves and CNN. So he's probably it doesn't surprise me that he's looking at that and just kind of laughing that the wrestling guy is trying to make fun of him on his TV. So that stuff was interesting when it came to, that sort of skits, because there was stuff I didn't know when they revealed that in the documentary, and those were important people to kind of chat with when it came to Vince McMahon. In terms of the rest of this, I don't know what else you kind of wanted to break down from this episode, because for me, I didn't really like this episode that much in terms of stuff that related back to Vince and why we were kind of looking at these certain topics.
Right. Well, I think the overarching look, they wanted to hit on the screw job because it's one of the most infamous things that's ever happened in wrestling, and Vince was the architect in getting his belt back from Bret Hart. So I think, look, for me and you and a lot of real hardcore wrestling fans, we know all about the screw job. I mean, I was there. And then to be able to find out about it and all the documentaries and all the things that have ever been said about it and happened about it, stories, like, we know the story. But I think if you're watching this from somebody who doesn't know Vince McMahon, like, they don't know wrestling, this is an integral part of the story because it's one of the most infamous things that's ever happened. But more importantly, it tells you, and I thought they did I wouldn't say a decent job.
They could have done a lot more when it comes to Montreal, if they're going to touch on it.
I was talking about the Wendy Richter Moolah thing.
Oh, yes. And that one too.
Right. But setting a precedent of that he is willing to do anything it takes to keep with him owning the company. And sometimes business rules all, and you have to do what's best for you. And I didn't like knowing the real story, which still won't get out there. I didn't like the fact that look, am I a Brett defender? Yes. I think Brett's a much better human being than Vince McMahon to his core. So I believe Brett a little bit more, but at the same time, they didn't tell the story enough where I actually, was watching with someone and paused it and told them the story that, look, they're painting it this way, but just so you know the rest of the story, that Brett was willing to lose the belt to anybody else if it wasn't Shawn. And he was willing to even lose to Shawn as long as it wasn't in Montreal. And they kind of painted the story like Brett was this person who was not going to live and do the things that were necessary to live by the business and the code and all of this stuff. And it's like, okay, there's an argument to be made that it's Vince's company. And if he wanted Brett to lose on November 9th in Montreal to Shawn Michaels, that's what has to happen because he's the boss. There's an argument to be made about that. But he also gave Brett some creative control. He also reneged on his contract. He also told him that he couldn't afford him and told him to go to another company, and was the one that didn't want Brett. So there was a lot that was happening in there. And what I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that I would have liked a little bit more background when they just said that Wendy Richter didn't want to lose the title and I had to do whatever it took to get my title back. I didn't really get a lot on that. Like, was that true? Did Wendy just not want to give the belt up completely? Like,
I could tell you.
Yeah, I know, but I should, and I want you to tell the audience,
sure.
But I shouldn't have to ask you.
Right.
My point is that I wanted the precedent to be set, the story. Like, even when they interviewed Wendy Richter, there was no, like, Wendy didn't really do a lot to help herself. Even if she's the victim, she didn't do a lot to help herself in the documentary.
Yeah.
So what is the story?
Yeah, in the case of, and kind of tying it in, because I think you make a great point, because I didn't think they explained either Wendy or Brett's case at all very well. Because if I'm just kind of a casual viewer, I'm an average Netflix goer, and I'm watching this documentary, I'm watching it thinking, man, all of this for a fake wrestling match, and they're upset that they're gonna lose a fake wrestling match, is kind of the way it came across. But in both cases, in the case of Wendy Richter, the reason why she was having issues with the company is because they were in contract negotiations, and Wendy at that time, she wasn't being pushed as big as Hogan, but she was essentially like she was going to be the female counterpart as part of the rise of the WWF at that point. And they were essentially in a contract negotiation where she wanted more money. It was never about the title. It was never about losing the match or anything like that. It was just, hey, I feel you're pushing me this way. I feel I've earned a chance to have some more money, to get more money if you want to push me at this certain level. Because she was in those Saturday morning cartoons with Hogan, and they were pushing all that stuff. And so that's really why Richter was kind of pushing back, and for whatever reason, Vince felt like, all right, well, we got to execute this with Moolah and do this screw job gimmick to try and get the title offer. And then, Richter ended up going to the AWA for a couple of years, but otherwise she left the business after that. And in the case of Brett, you touched on it there. He had the creative control in his contract, and when they reneged on the contract, when Vince did, Brett had a creative control where he could choose how he wanted the last 3 months of his time in the WWF to go. And he would have put Shawn over, but then Shawn, at a Raw taping a couple months before the screw job, they were having a conversation. Brett said, I'd put you over. Like, I know we have issues, but I'm going to put you over. And Shawn says, well, that's great, Brett, because I would never put you over if I was the champion. And that just kind of culminated in the rivalry between Shawn and Brett. And so that's why Brett didn't want to put over Shawn's. Like, if he's not going to do that for me, I'm not going to do that for him. I will lose to anybody else. He even said, and now I don't generally believe this, but he's emphasized it to make a point, that I will even lose to the Brooklyn Brawler on a house show if need be, but I'm not losing it to Brett. And what's also kind of lost in the story is people think that his contract was supposed to end the next night, but it wasn't. He had a month left in his deal. And even if they wanted to, even if there was a legitimate concern about, Brett could bring the WWF title to Nitro, the WCW and WWF were in a lawsuit at that point where WWF had sued WCW for intellectual property because of the Medusa angle a couple of years earlier where they put the title in the trash can. And so that would have just screwed over WCW in the lawsuit that they were currently facing if they had Brett show up with the title. So they couldn't really legally do it. Brett still had a month to go before he could drop the title. He had the creative control. And the reason why he didn't want to do it is because Sean wouldn't do it for him. He was willing to do it, as you mentioned, for everybody else. But Sean, made that statement. He said, all right, if Sean's not going to do it, I'm going to not do it for you as well. So they didn't explain that well in the doc. And
no, they didn't explain any of that in the doc. And again, the point that you made about a casual person that goes, yeah, well, that is on Wendy and that is on Brett because they should just lose the fake title when the fake wrestling match when their boss tells them to. And
exactly.
It's like, there's just so much more in there. But these examples were made, and I'm assuming, to tell the stories of certainly the screw job, but also, the power that Vince McMahon ultimately had and what he was willing to do for the business. And so I just didn't like a lot of this. And, we could get into the weeds of who Brett should have lost to and but I just want to make the point that in no way, shape, or form can you convince me that the best thing to do for business would have been for Brett to lose to Sean that night when you still had a month, you still had other contenders, you still could have done something else, and you still could have gone back to Sean and go, Sean, you go apologize to Brett and say you would have actually dropped the title to him, and then Brett might have done it anyway. There was just so many other ways, and there's no way you can convince me. When they dig in and they say, but it was best for business that it happened on that night, you're like, not really. And if it were so best for business, Sean telling Brett that he wouldn't do the same for him and put him over, that's not best for business. So I just, look, that's kind of the wrestling portion of it, but the Vince McMahon portion of it is that he would do anything at all costs. And I guess I didn't like this too, because I don't know. Again, I was watching with someone who doesn't know Vince McMahon from a hole in the ground, and he kind of came off sympathetic. The comment was made to me, wow, look at him. He was the bigger man and kind of walked into the dressing room with Brett. I'm like, that doesn't make him a big man.
No.
For walking into the dressing room? No. He did that for his ego.
Yep.
So.
And then Brett plopped Vince in the face in that Wrestling with Shadows documentary, which is a great documentary that people need to check out just in general. And they even showed the tape because Brett came in with a wire because he felt like something was going to happen that night, and you could hear the conversation he and Vince had in that documentary as well. If you want to learn more about the screw job, Wrestling with Shadows is a fantastic documentary just in general. By the way, just a correction on one of the names I said Kelly Kapowski. That is actually from Saved by the Bell. Her name is Kay Koplovitz, was the businesswoman for USA.
See, I thought you said Kelly Kaprowski.
Yeah, I think I said Kaplowski or something like that.
Yeah, you didn't actually say Kelly Kapowski, because I would have corrected your Saved by the Bell reference as well. I thought her name was very similar, but I thought, he did differentiate her name. Good for her.
the alliteration kind of threw me off, but
good for you for knowing Tiffany Amber Thiessen. I think that's excellent. So this one kind of wraps up to me. I didn't like the fact that he came across a little sympathetic in this episode from poor, locally run, family-owned business, old poor Vinny getting picked on by Ted Turner when he never, like, even when Scott Hall and Kevin Nash went, they left after their contracts were done. At what point did Ted Turner poach somebody under contract from WCW? Like for WCW from WWE? Did he ever do that?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Vince was just upset because Ted was paying more money than Vince was at that point.
Right. But he actually never poached anybody from the lineup.
Not that I'm aware of.
Right. So in the 80s, when Vince went in, and because there was no guaranteed contracts in the 80s, he went in and literally took the biggest star, knowing that would put that promoter out of business. And he did it anyway. And he's trying to make it seem like he's the sympathetic one. And then even in the screw job, kind of at least relatable for people who don't know the story. It's relatable that the owner of a business wants to have control of his business back, and that's why he did those things, when that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
And I just didn't like the way that Netflix presented this to make it give some sympathy to Vince McMahon during these times where I don't think he deserved any.
Yeah.
So
and there were other things too where it's like I was going into this like, all right, we're talking about Montreal and I know this story, but how are they going to relate it back to Vince? Like when I was viewing this documentary, I'm like, okay, how are they going to put this in the angle of Vince's psyche and Vince's mindset? And there were just a couple, especially this episode, started to become a little more prominent for me about stuff where it's like, oh, well, sure, if this was a history of WWE documentary, I guess you talk about this, but please tell me why we are talking about the curtain call right now. You know, like I get it in a history of WWE podcasts, and I know the thought process of Vince and WWE's history is so intertwined, but how does this relate back to how Vince views things with the curtain call? And how is as someone who is looking at this from an outside the wrestling bubble, looking at this saying, well, this makes me learn more about Vince, you know, like it doesn't. And so when they were talking about, they dedicated a lot of time for the curtain call. And I was like, why are we doing this? Like, how is this relating back to Vince? There's been a couple of moments like that in this series so far where it's like, you know, WrestleMania 2, it's like, well, I don't really think this is relating back to Vince McMahon at all. Like, they didn't really touch it back. Like, at least with the screw jobs, you can look into the mindset of everything is business, right? Mm-hmm. And at least from that perspective, it's like, okay, at least that's why they talked about this. But there's just some stuff where it's like, some creative decisions here where I'm like, I don't understand why we're covering this right now.
I'm personally, having not seen them, hoping that this changes for episode number 4, but we will see. That's a pretty good recap of the screw job. Attitude. Well, what I said there was attitude. And the name of the program number 4, kind of took off from the end of the screw job of episode number 3 and launched into WrestleMania and the new year. It began with Brett again. It ended with Owen. A lot of Hart family stuff in here, but a lot of crap in the middle. And for this, Zach, one of the things that really hit me, because I happen and you happen and wrestling fans know a lot about that era, is that I hang on to things that I didn't know. And one of the things that really struck me at the beginning of this episode and kind of set the tone for me for Vince McMahon not being a good human being. Unfortunately, this one fell a little bit down the family tree, which was, I don't know if it was an outtake or whatever, but it was Stephanie's realization that Mike Tyson already had been arrested for rape when they hired him to become the focal point and really turning around the 83 weeks of dominance from WCW when Mike Tyson entered the fold between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels. It it tipped the scales a little bit back to the WWE at the time. But the first thing that struck me was that Stephanie McMahon kind of finding out that, oh, he was arrested for rape already and we hired him. And kind of that look of like, oh, that's not good.
Yeah.
And that kind of set the tone here for me into, some other things about Vince McMahon in this episode that I'm just like, oh my God. But this is the first one.
Yeah, it was kind of the naivete of Stephanie McMahon there. Not only, as you mentioned, arrested for rape, but also served his sentence at that time, but had just gotten out of jail for rape. Was Mike Tyson. So that was an interesting clip. I seem to have come from a WWE documentary back in that time that, as you mentioned, either was an outtake or some sort of a segment that didn't make it to the final cut of a documentary, and that certainly kind of set the tone. And one of the things as well that also I thought was kind of interesting right from the very start of the episode too, kind of outlining the background of Vince, was they talked about that story with Dr. Jerry Graham and how Dr. Jerry Graham was his favorite wrestler growing up as a kid in his father's WWF promotion. And if you know any of the stories about Dr. Jerry Graham and how he used to really live it up back in those days and partying, I thought it was interesting how he talked about that story and how he, learned a little bit more about Jerry Graham and being with Jerry Graham. And I think it's kind of one of the things that kind of underlines how we know Vince today. Because if you know the stories about Dr. Jerry Graham, the guy, to say he lived it up to the extreme would be an understatement. So I thought that was also interesting in terms of kind of setting up that background of Vince McMahon.
Yeah, and the fact of one of the things, and I can't remember where it was in the documentary, but it kind of sets the tone, I think, for even what's to come still, is that as the Mr. McMahon character evolved from the screw job in Montreal, the thought that Vince McMahon always wanted to be a character, and his dad wouldn't let him, and it wasn't the right thing to do, but deep down he always wanted to be a character. And this to me is, I want to be careful here, but I hope people understand where I'm coming from. Owners in business, we happen to be, you and I, involved in the wrestling business and in the sports business. I know you're involved in the news business. You're a news mogul, sports mogul, wrestling mogul. It's like you're going to be the Dave Meltzers on television. We get it, Zach. We know you don't have to put yourself over. But in business, I know it exists outside of these realms, but I think in the sports and wrestling realms specifically, we have a little bit more experience in those realms. So when I say this, I'm talking for those realms, understanding that it happens in all walks of life.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the good owners and the bad owners in just professional sports. And then in wrestling, when you talk about promoters back in the day and owning territories, and in professional sports, there's a lot of bad owners. And do you know why they're bad owners? They're bad owners because they just can't help themselves. Because they're rich, they think they're smart. And I know Vince touched on it, and I really want to get into this during this episode, but there are a lot of owners in professional sports that don't just understand it from a business point of view, but they want to be involved. They want to make decisions. They end up meddling in things that are way over their head, but because they own the team, they think they can. And Vince McMahon was always one of those guys. he wanted to be the central figure. And when I know some people give him credit as one of the greatest and biggest heels in wrestling history. But he wanted to do that all the time. That was what he wanted to do because his ego wouldn't have anything else. And I was just really struck by that's what's at the core of all of it, right? You think of other owners, like I'll point out the former owner of the Ottawa Senators. Just wanted to own a team, but he wanted to be involved. Liked being the boss. And there are people that like being the boss and like having the final word. And because they have money, they end up doing that. And I think, again, one of the lines in this that Vince McMahon started out in this episode talking about the character that he knew a lot about the character because he grew up poor. He grew up and didn't have anything. And so he knew how to act from what he didn't have. And that's just complete crap. Did he go through hardships in his life? Yeah, we all do. But that to me was that set the tone again for this episode of like, oh my God, it's really hard to watch you and have you come across when you are telling people that you acted out as a character. And this is refuted later in the program by a lot of people. But you thought that you were doing things on camera because of you grew up the opposite. Come on, Zach. That's just not true.
Yeah.
And what happened to him being on camera was all ego driven. It wasn't because he knew how to be a great character from the hardships that he had growing up.
Yeah.
What did you think about him saying like he knew what to do because of what he didn't have?
Yeah, it's something I've kind of touched on during this review of this show where Vince is one of those guys that throughout his time owning the WWE, WWF, and learning more about him through interviews and whatnot, is that because of professional wrestling and the image that you want to portray on the screen, a lot of the times I take the things that he says about, I was being raised poor and I'm going to take that element and put it into my character and all this stuff. And, he talks about how he's a self-proclaimed billionaire, like a self-made billionaire, I should say. And they touched on it with the Ted Turner stuff where it's like, this is a family business that we're going up against the big bad evil corporation in Turner that's trying to take us out. You look at a lot of those elements and the way that it's all portrayed, and it all goes back to him trying to portray himself as an underdog. And it's portraying him as this sort of guy that, he's willing to fight and keep on climbing and climbing to the top, and no other obstacle will get in his way, because a lot of people can get behind an underdog story. And I think that's what Vince has learned, obviously, through professional wrestling, telling stories through professional wrestling, and also being in a business where you want to showcase what you want on screen to be the thoughts of what people are seeing. In the case of, you want your top babyface to be liked by your fans so that you can get them into the building and draw money. And I think that's kind of goes back into the PR playbook that Vince portrayed and relayed all throughout his time as the owner of the WWF and being in the executive chairman and the board as well. Is he always want to portray himself as the underdog and as the guy that's willing to fight against whatever sort of higher being that he's created for himself, because that is something that the public could get behind and try and babyface himself, essentially, to just use a wrestling term. So that's what I kind of took away from this as well, is that he really likes to try and babyface himself and try and portray himself as that sort of guy where, like you, Lee, especially in the wrestling business where, let's face it, performers and wrestlers are taught and trained to lie to their audience to try and gain a reaction. and try and evoke an emotion. I just see that with Vince, and I hear all this stuff, and and it's always going to continue to be who is the real Vince McMahon and who is not the real Vince McMahon in terms of his upbringing. We know about how he alleges of the sexual abuse that he took as a young child, but that's the problem with Vince is you can't just take his stuff at face value. You have to try and understand if this is a guy that's trying to portray an image, a PR image that some people still think to this day, even with everything that has gone on, that he's an underdog, that it's just the image that he tries to portray. And I think that's one of the things that the episode tried to show as well, is that this is what he's trying to show.
Well, again, as they're going along and, they bring in Mike Tyson and they start to change things and they really get into, bringing in, making Austin as big as he was, and then The Rock, and then they needed Mr. McMahon as the character to go up against. And I think one of the things that made me laugh, but I kind of felt it just helped me more have no sympathy for him, is the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
When he said that he was the total opposite of his character on TV. And then you get a couple of people, like, you kind of get that middle ground of the family kicking. I know Shane was on saying, well, it's him, just a really highly exaggerated form. And then as you start to get more, all of a sudden there's Sean and there's Steve Austin and there's other people saying, yeah, it's pretty much, and Hogan said, it's the same guy. And, people will say, oh, well, it's him exaggerated. And the best storytellers are, truths of themselves, just exaggerated. And I actually concur with that. I can tell you that, and I'm not trying to be facetious when I say this, some of the time that I was on the radio, I was an exaggerated form of myself. I would say it was still me. It was just not exactly who I was, like an exaggerated form. And some days would be less and some days would be more. And I think that's okay when you're in some sort of performing situation. But when he truly believes it was exactly the opposite, like he comes across as this, arrogant asshole boss that is, probably the worst human being alive, but I'm exactly the opposite away from it. Well, actually, no, facts say that you're not. And, even, and you must have loved this, even Bruce Pritchard saying, yeah, no, it's pretty much the same. Like, I took a lot of those tongue lashings.
I was just going to bring that up too. That eternal yes man and ass kisser, Bruce Pritchard, even was saying, yeah, this is pretty much Vince.
Right. And Bruce Pritchard's a Vince guy through and through, all the way.
Oh, yes.
And so even him saying that is telling. And I just think that this, I don't know how sometimes people, Zach, almost talk themselves into and convince themselves that they're somebody that they're not. And I think it happens with a lot of people who run businesses. Surround yourself with yes people, hear the same things all the time, and then actually start to believe the things that are not true. And I didn't feel bad for him in this episode at all. I'm just, I was laughing at some points where it's like, no, even the people that still love and respect you somehow are saying the opposite is true. And that part really stuck with me because I actually think this is the biggest point of episode number 4. It's the ability or non-ability to see yourself outside of yourself, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Looking in on yourself from the outside. Can you do it? Like a lot of people who have egos, they have a very difficult time doing that, but he really, really didn't. And I think it led to a whole bunch of mistakes. And, they went through like getting back from, and this isn't an Eric Bischoff commentary, but Eric Bischoff basically came on this doc and was like, I'm the first person that's ever thought up the boss as a bad guy. In like, nobody's ever thought it up before, but Vince just did it better than me. But I thought it up first.
Yeah.
Yes, Eric. You're the first person that ever thought that a bad guy could be a boss on TV.
What a genius.
Oh my God.
Yeah. That was, I will say, when it comes to Bischoff, I thought he came across better here, strangely enough, than he did in the Who Killed WCW series. And that series was put together to make him look good, too. I felt like with this Bischoff that was presented here, I could at least believe this was the Eric Bischoff that I had known, through on TV, to his commentary, to everything else. So I will say that. I don't know if you want to take that as a compliment or anything like that, but that's something I kind of took away from Bischoff on here. And I get it. You got to have Bischoff on here when you're talking about something like this, when it comes to the late 90s and how there's a battle between WCW, WWE. And it's the stuff we as wrestling fans have heard for however many years now. So there wasn't really anything new here. I wish they could have gone a little bit deeper into some of the other elements. They talked about how the Attitude Era pushed the bar, and they talked about one of the best segments on this documentary was Vince they did these great cuts of Vince saying, well, we had no rapists on the show, and then it cut to Vince saying, come on out, you rapist. And then it cut
no guns on the show,
yeah, and it's the Brian Pillman angle, like, and it's like, and they also showed the the choppy your PP segment as well on with no knives. So I thought that was pretty funny. But then there were other ones which I wish they could have delved a little bit deeper on, because they showed some of the blackface angles that happened during this time when DX was dressed up in blackface again in their feud against the Nation of Domination. I thought they could go a little bit deeper on that. They talked a little bit about Sable here, which I was actually surprised they mentioned when it came to the lawsuit that she put together during that time. I will say, though, the one thing that this episode absolutely drops the ball on, and it's actually, I found it shameful how they covered this topic, was the death of Owen Hart.
Yep.
I thought it was absolutely dreadful how they put this all together and made it seem like it was just an accident, when there was far more to this incident than, it's just an unfortunate accident. They didn't talk about, I didn't expect them to, but like, they didn't talk about, in that Dark Side of the Ring episode, they had Martha Hart show the hook that Owen was on when he was coming down, and was used for sailboats. And the weight from that hook, if he shifted around, it would automatically detach. And that's how he fell from the rafters. They didn't talk about how police didn't stop the show when they got out there. They did touch on a little bit. Now, this one is a little... It's tough because it's been highly debated, but on this show too, they showed that there was blood on the mat, and they were wrestling with blood on the mat. And they tried to insinuate that was Owen's blood that they were wrestling on. And that was really more, there was a segment on Heat earlier where Gangrel spit the blood, that gimmick that he was doing with the Brood. And it was that blood that he was doing earlier on. It wasn't Owens. So they kind of touched on that too, but I thought it was the way that they talked about the Owens stuff was just a travesty how they covered this. It should have been so much better. because this was not merely, an accident. This was something that they didn't talk about how they tried to get a different rigger out there. They fired the original guy because they wanted the system that Owen was on to be much quicker so that it'd be a smoother entrance. And despite the original guy saying, hey, I don't like this stunt that you're doing, I will come back at a cheaper rate to make sure that this stunt goes forward properly, and they still said no. All of this stuff they didn't talk about in this segment, which I thought was just, I thought it was an absolute travesty how they covered this.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly concur with that. And I think, this one made me sad because it wasn't about, it made me mad about Vince McMahon. It just made me more sad about what happened to Owen Hart.
Yeah.
And what happened to his family and what happened to his friends. Look, Brett thinking that they're doing things 2 years later to still try and get back at him. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I don't care. But when he said on the show, if it were Shane McMahon, that they wouldn't have, of course they would have stopped the show. Of course they would have. And Vince going out there and saying, if it were my own body, I'd want them to go on with the show. That is just absolutely ludicrous.
Yeah.
You might want them to go on with the show because you're so self-absorbed, but nobody else would want to go on with the show.
Yeah. And that question too was interesting. I'm glad they asked that, because for those that don't know, who are big hockey fans that listen in, some might not know this, but Jeff Merrick used to be a big wrestling guy back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
I know Jeff Merrick was such a big wrestling guy that I did some free work for him for live audio wrestling.
Oh, really? That I didn't know.
Yeah, see, sometimes nuggets come up. When I was trying to get into the business and in school in the 90s, Jeff Merrick and live audio wrestling was everything to me.
Absolutely.
And so I did basically free research for him.
There you go.
Trying to get my foot in the door, because there was a wrestling show on the radio back then. It was everything to me. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that live audio wrestling was a big thing back in those days. And one of the things that Jeff used to do all the time as well was he would help contribute for those off the record interviews with Michael Landsberg when wrestlers would be on, and Vince was on, Bischoff was on, Brett was on. Merrick helped with those interviews. And he has said before, when Michael Landsberg interviewed Vince McMahon about Owen's death, he said the one question he admitted that he should have had in the run sheet, and he wished he could have had, was if Shane was in that holster going down from the rafters and he fell and everything that happened to him, would the show have been stopped? So in that sense, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I know what you're saying, but us even talking about this, it's so ludicrous that show went on. And it doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter. Nobody would want Shane McMahon to have done it so Vince could prove that it was different and Vince is a bad human being, because this is about Owen, right? This is about that show. Insanely, they come over the air on pay-per-view and say that Owen Hart has died. Jim Ross didn't even use the passed away. He's died.
Yep.
In our ring. But enjoy Jeff Jarrett against Val Venus and the puppies, and enjoy the main event. It was one of the worst decisions in business. Like he said, as a businessman, I had to make the decision to move on. I can't even imagine telling other people to go on with the show and thinking that that was good for business. You
Yep.
tell me that you come over the arena and you come out to these fans and you're crying on the microphone and saying, Owen Hart has passed away. I'm sorry, we're going to have to cancel the show. You think what? You think people were going to riot?
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
What are they going to do? Storm the ring? We will gladly get you your money back and more. Obviously, we cannot go on with this show.
Yeah. And it shouldn't have even been Vince's call in the first place to make. Like, police should have stopped that show.
Yeah.
Like, even if they found through investigation that it was accidental or whatnot, a death happened.
Yeah.
And a crime scene needed to be established.
Yep.
And the fact that the police did not do that is like, I agree with you as a businessman. That what Vince did to make that call was asinine, but it shouldn't have even been Vince's decision to make in the first place. Like, it should have been, that decision should have been taken out of his hands, and police should have come in and said, all right, this is a crime scene now. This is our investigation. We are now going to look into what happened here with Owen Hart. And the fact that the live crowd didn't know until they got back about what happened with Owen Hart, they thought it was, part of the show, something was going on. I'm sure others thought something serious happened, but, it's unfortunately with pro wrestling, there are some people that would have thought that was part of the show and right. it's part of the whole ordeal.
Well, you never know for sure.
Exactly.
I remember sitting at the Survivor Series, the screw job, right? You're 99% sure of what you're looking at and seeing and thinking is happening, but you don't know.
Exactly.
So I don't know. I thought the documentary didn't do a good job at digging into that part of it as well. Like, I would actually want to know more about why the Kansas City Police didn't stop the show. Like, what? Just give me, as a viewer, in one of the worst things that could ever happen, give me a timeline of how it all went down, rightly or wrongly. Why did the Kansas City Police not stop the show? I don't know that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice to know?
Would be great to know. Because I'd really like to know that thought process, why they didn't stop the show.
Yeah, but did Vince McMahon pull rank over them? And they were scared of Vince McMahon too? I don't know.
No. And the fact, too, that they didn't show that press conference clip. I don't know if you've seen this clip, Lee, but it's literally a press conference after Over the Edge. And a woman asks him about, any sort of precautions and whatnot that was taking place before the stunt came in. And Vince saying, well, I resent your tone on that question. And her saying, well, I resent that answer and your sarcasm. Like, that whole interaction would have been a great way to show how Vince thinks when it comes to this sort of stuff. And I don't remember it being in this documentary, that back and forth between that reporter and Vince.
No, it absolutely was not. And I, as you said, even when somebody died in his ring, he thinks he can control the message.
Yep.
And that's what I think this was the episode, even though it was not the more either entertaining or informative episode. This is the episode that really hit me, that the guy is he really thinks that he can control everybody else because he's better than them, richer than them, whatever it is. That if I say something goes, then it goes. And that, I'm sure we're going to find out even a little bit more. And you see the things coming up that most of these interviews were done before he stepped away, and all the allegations. And like, for a long time, that guy has lived in a world where he thinks he just controls everything he does. There are no police. There are no rules when it comes to people like him, because he can always get himself or other people out of trouble. And that's a really hard thing to come to grips with, especially as a wrestling fan who loves product. and the person who has controlled the product, that is what they think. And that's who controlled the business for, most of my lifetime.
Mm.
That's a really hard thing to come around as to why I love the business, and that the person who controlled the business and had the biggest influence over the business was that type of person.
Yeah. And not only that too, like they touched on a little bit on this episode, but how they were able to kind of get fans to just be, so loyal to him, and controversies that would happen during this era that in other companies, it would just shatter other companies. In this company, it just seemed to be just another thing that would just kind of, bounce off the shield that was the WWE. Like they talked about it during the Trish barks like a dog segment as well. So, and they talked about that sort of dichotomy. So yeah, it was just a lot of that when it came to like what was good taste in the Attitude Era, and sort of the fan base that it's sort of encapsulated. They really touched on a little bit. I wish they could have gone a little bit further, and that's kind of my sort of theme so far with this documentary.
Episode number 4, Mr. McMahon on Netflix, Attitude. So, the Netflix number 5. I have to admit, when I watched this one, Zach, it fired me up, family business, even more than some of the other episodes have, which I can't even believe is true, but it kind of sets me up for what I'm hoping for the final episode is a little bit more. So instead of me starting off, I want you to kind of start off with a little bit of your take on family business, how Shane McMahon gets into the business, gets out of the business, how Stephanie was brought in, how Linda McMahon was there, some of the things that happened, and how Vince McMahon spoke about his own family being directly involved in the business from beginning to end, like nothing trumps business. That really was the way that this documentary kind of started, and I'm eager to hear your initial thoughts on this episode and some of the things that for you that really stood out.
Yeah, I think you touched on it there, and really to kind of hone in on it, specifically the relationship between Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon was what really stuck out for me in this episode. We had heard for the longest time about, the relationship between Shane and Vince, and Shane's relationship with the family in general when he left the WWE back in the late 2000s before making his return in the late 2010s. So I thought the dichotomy of these two in terms of Vince McMahon, as you mentioned, and that's kind of the central theme throughout the documentary about how business trumps everything in the mind of Vince McMahon. And, Shane was a guy that wanted to have the affection from his father and wanted to get the thumbs up, the hug. But it seemed to be, whenever there were sort of ideas that Shane wanted to pitch, Vince would shut it down. And I believe, there was the thing with Paul Heyman talking about, a dinner that they had as well. And how you have to get through me if you want this business. It's a very Paul Heyman way of describing it. It's very flamboyant. It's very over the top, for lack of a better term, but it really kind of drives home the point in terms of, the relationship between Shane and Vince and how it's kind of evolved and at some points devolved over the years. To me, that was my biggest takeaway from this episode, was that relationship and how they honed in on it. In fact, I thought this was one of the stronger parts of the documentary. So there was some interesting stuff there when it came to that.
Yeah, so I'd like to expand on what you said, because it was the same for me. And I think one of the things that really stuck out was, look, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And do we know exactly what the relationship is between Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon? No. But it does paint a little bit more of a picture that it's not exactly as tight as maybe a lot of people would think that it is, especially with him being on camera, and a character and involved in some of the dealings. And when he went away, did people really know why he went away? I think what I took from this, Zach, for the most part, was I left this episode with the fact that I don't think they're tight.
No.
Would you agree?
I would agree with that. Yes.
Okay. How many wrestlers would you say along the way, and you don't have to name an exact number, but is it a lot, some, few, none? How many wrestlers have said over the years that they consider Vince a father figure?
Oh, quite a bit. There's been quite a few wrestlers, all the way from like top name wrestlers, especially, but even downwards to some of the mid card. It seems like there's a lot of wrestlers that kind of look to Vince as that sort of father figure.
That makes me really sad.
Mm-hmm.
That you are not a father figure in your son's eyes, and at least that's the way it came across. I don't know that for sure. I would even go as far as to speculate that Stephanie McMahon's been involved in the business all the way through, and of course with her marriage to Triple H, Paul Levesque, and them running the business behind the scenes. I wonder what her relationship really is with her father. But there was that one scene that had them walking away talking about, that Shane just wanted at some point to take over the business and was willing to put in his time and even leave the business to come back and learn. And Vince just kept saying, like, this is my business. You didn't do this. I did this. I did this. This is my business. I make the decisions. And it's like, yeah, for sure. I get it. You think that, you bought your dad out for what? You borrowed money until you get, they documented it earlier in the show, how he borrowed a little bit of money and ended up paying his dad back. It would be nowhere near what Shane would have had to do to buy the company. And Vince, whether it was Shane or Stephanie, or he seemed to have this disconnect between everything that he accomplished. He wants to make sure that not only does the world see that he accomplished this, but his son, his daughter, it doesn't matter, family. I did this. I created this. I did this. You didn't do it. So no matter what you do to learn, no matter what you do to, put yourself in the middle of it and try and learn the business as best you can. So at one point you can take over for me. He's like, that's just not happening. He's so egotistical that he can't even do that for his family. He can't walk side by side with his family and not tell them, like, this is mine. This isn't yours. This is mine. And then every wrestler, not everyone, but you know what I mean? I would even go further than that. A ton of wrestlers would say, I would consider Vince McMahon a father figure. Massive names, mid-card names, you name it, they say it. But the disconnect between his own family and what he did to them, like, look, when you are responsible for your own actions at some point, where if you're Shane McMahon or Stephanie McMahon or Linda McMahon, you don't have to go on TV and watch your husband make out with Trish Stratus while you're in a coma. You don't have to do that. You chose to do that. imagine Vince McMahon doing that, thinking that that's a good idea because it's best for business. The best thing possible for business is for me to make out with every young girl that comes along and have my wife watch on TV. I disgusting is not even the word for it. For me, it's beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think they referred to it in this episode about how many times like he would kind of claim that it's best for business when it was really just him playing out kind of his own world, like his own fantasies in his own world, and using his wife and kids to do that is beyond anything that I don't even have a way of sort of comprehending what that you would think that that's a good idea and that people would go along. So this is a really hard show for me to watch, this one, because this one cemented, look, you can do bad things in the world. I get it. People do bad things all the time in the world. And a lot of it has to do with ego and invincibility and it doesn't make it right. And I actually feel very, very bad for, you know, the victims of crimes, of some of the things that have happened along the way. But this guy doesn't care about anybody. It's one thing not to care about a stranger or somebody that you sort of are in business. So it's another thing to not care about your family. And I can't believe I'm missing the words here, the difference between what he would do and the roles he would put his family in, and then these other wrestlers, how many of them have come along saying that he was a father figure to them? My mind is blown with that kind of stuff, that could be possible.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me too of when Jon Moxley left the WWE and did that interview with Jericho about his time in the WWE. He mentions when talking with Vince McMahon that Vince has this sort of Jedi mind trick that he would do with wrestlers. And Moxley made it a point to say, I'm not going to fall for the Jedi mind trick that Vince would play on me, because he was so committed on leaving the company at that point that, you know, the envelope with the offer of all this money, he didn't even want to look at it because he wanted to leave that company so badly. And I think it kind of goes back to, you know, all these wrestlers kind of falling under the Jedi mind trick of Vince McMahon, where he's able to manipulate. And because, as you mentioned, he has this wealth, this power behind him, that he feels this invincibility because of all of it. And because he's essentially a lone player, especially after the Monday Night Wars, he's a lone player in the wrestling business. So there's this thought process of, well, I got to do what this guy says, because if I don't, I'm going to lose a job. And there's nowhere else for me to go other than toiling away in the indies. So it really is, as you mentioned, like watching it and you just kind of see it on screen. And I think for some that watched during that era, they thought, you know, oh, this was this crazy guy and this is just hilarious watching all of this. But now you kind of look at through this lens, everything that's happened since then, you know, with all the stuff with Janelle Grant and more that's come out since then, about Vince McMahon, and you go back into this era through this documentary, you kind of look at every sort of storyline that's been done and you see it from a modern eyes, and it's easy to kind of look back, hindsight being 2020, and look at stuff, but it really does open your eyes on just what he was able to get away with so blatantly too, by the way, on screen, and was able to get past everybody. Yeah, as you mentioned, having, you know, booking affair storylines on TV. One of the things that was kind of interesting as well, I don't know if you caught this in your watching. I don't know if you had the subtitles on for the documentary, but it was kind of noted that there was the segment. They talked a lot about Sable and the lawsuit in this episode as well.
Yep.
And there's that scene where the producer he says, "What about your affair with Sable?" And Vince is kind of caught off guard. He's kind of looking around. He's like, I don't know. And you hear a voice in the background. If you don't have the subtitles on, you hear somebody yell, storyline in the background. And he's like, oh, storyline. Ah, ha, ha. It's, yeah, that was the whole thing that we did. I thought that was interesting in the sense that if you look at the storylines, they actually say who the person that was that shouted out storyline. And it was Paul Heyman that shouted that out over to Vince, which I thought was interesting because it kind of goes into that inner circle that Vince McMahon had at that time, and Heyman being a part of that inner circle now. So I thought that was interesting for that standpoint, but also, you know, just how he looks at this stuff and says, you know, I this was all for business. And going back to Heyman as well, he mentions that Vince only has one true monogamous relationship in his life, and that's with the wrestling business. And you just hear all this stuff, and you got to think, man, there's got to be more to your life than just the business. You have family, you've got other aspirations, and we hear so much about Vince and his character in terms of how he just doesn't sleep, and he's so committed to the business that nothing else matters. And there's always been the joke that he probably has no hobbies because he's just so committed to it. So it really kind of shines a light on all of that, and you really learn a little bit more about Vince himself through this episode.
Yeah, you do. And I think for the viewer that doesn't know a ton about wrestling, you would understand that, like, he comes across, and that's the thing that bothers me the most, not just in this episode, but the whole documentary so far, is kind of still coming off as this family-owned business, that he was a victim of a lot of things growing up, and almost, they don't say it, but it comes across like it's not all his fault because of some of the things. Like, he's like this because.
Yeah.
And I just hate that. Like, it's just such an excuse. It doesn't mean that all of those things didn't happen, but there's just been so many people in the world that have had things happen to them. Everyone's had stuff happen to them, and people, they learn, they get help, they fix it, they don't let it happen to the next generation. And it's just this point where it's like, he's too much of this, to me, came across again like he was somehow a victim. And as you said, he's married to the business, and that's the only monogamous relationship. And it's like, oh, okay, I understand. He's just so committed to the business that screw everybody else. Well, that's great if it doesn't. It makes you a bad person, but if you're not married and you don't have kids and you don't actually commit crimes against people, at some point you go, okay, well, that's just not a good guy. But now it's just so beyond that. And I don't know. The whole Sable thing, I don't understand, because if you're committed to something, like if you're Sable and you're committed to something, the fact that you go back on screen and be his lover again on screen after suing him doesn't help the cause for her, or, you know, and Brock Lesnar still being involved in the company. It's just, Doc, this one hurt me a lot, because it was, if you watch this and didn't know anything about wrestling, you would always tell someone, like, if you watch this, you go, why would I watch that person's product? If you had never watched wrestling before and you're like, oh, I'm interested in watching wrestling, let's find out about Vince McMahon and then watch this documentary. Why would you ever watch wrestling? I don't know the answer to that.
Yep.
And
also too, touching upon the Sable stuff as well, they also delved into the Trish Stratus deal as well. Whole the barking like a dog segment.
Yep.
Which every time I watch that, it just ages worse and worse. I hadn't seen that segment in years.
Oh, it's squeamish.
It's very uncomfortable. And I thought, though, the two journalists there, Meltzer and the female journalist there, that whose name all of a sudden escapes me, but I thought they did a good job of breaking it down of, like, you know, the audience that they attracted at that time when it came to that storyline, how it's supposed to be a story of the heel boss, like, you know, yelling at this woman, right? And he's the heel and she's supposed to be the babyface. But the way that they presented the product at the time, the crowd was cheering on Vince throughout that whole ordeal. And it's still like, it still makes me uncomfortable, especially now with all the stuff that's come out. Like, I just, watching that whole thing again, it's like what you were mentioning, like, if you wanted to tell somebody why you watch wrestling, you absolutely would not show this. And if somebody that was new and didn't know anything about wrestling was watching this, they would also be looking at this and thinking, man, why would somebody want to watch this product if this is what's kind of being shown on screen? So yeah, that segment, when they brought that back, I was, you know, I was uncomfortable again. And everything that kind of went on with Sable and those were really, like, it was uncomfortable, but it was necessary parts of the story in terms of trying to tell the Vince McMahon person and character and what they're trying to get across with him in this documentary. So I thought those were the strongest points in a way. And then a lot of the other parts of the episode were stuff that I could do without. I didn't need talk about the XFL. I didn't really need talk about.
Oh, no, hold on. I'm going to cut you off. And at least the best part of this one, by far, one of the best things that is happened in this whole documentary. Bob Costas dropped an F-bomb.
That's true. That's true.
Come on.
That totally caught me off guard. That's true.
Bob Costas just dropped an F-bomb. It was incredible.
I never heard him swear before. Never heard him say the F word before. That blew me away. That's true. That is true.
I literally sat up. I'm like, oh my God. And I haven't gone back and watched it yet, but I want to. I didn't realize it was that contentious between Costas and McMahon in that segment where they kind of got nose to nose, and it told me everything about Vince.
Yep.
Like, hey, we're going to go off script here and ask you a couple of tough questions. He didn't like tough questions. He didn't have answers. And his answer to the tough questions is, I want to rip your head off.
Yeah.
Because I don't really have an answer, because you're asking fair questions and I'm a scumbag and I don't really have answers to your questions. So my answer then is, I'm going to rip your head off.
Yeah. And I'm Vince McMahon right now, and I don't have control of the situation.
Yep.
That's the big thing too. Like, he's always been in a controlled environment, making his own universe, having his own people around him. Everything is controlled around him. But as soon as you mentioned it, Bob Costas, went on a different direction to talk about the really bad ratings for the XFL. As soon as Vince McMahon sensed he didn't have that control, you just saw it. He just lost his cool. And this is not the first time when it comes to Vince where he's lost his cool in an interview. And so, yeah, that stuff with Costas was interesting in terms of the actual analysis of the XFL, the way that they presented it. I thought if you're going to do it, you had to angle it to where it's like, this guy has tried to expand out to different parts of business that's not just wrestling for so long, whether it be the Bodybuilding Federation, the XFL, ICO Pro, the restaurant in New York Times.
Times Square.
Times Square, I should say. My bad. All of these different business ventures that Vince has taken part in, and the only thing that he's really ever been successful at has been pro wrestling. And so if they wanted to look at it from the angle of, he's tried to get out of wrestling and go into these different ventures, but he has not been able to go into these different ventures and be successful, that'd be one thing. But the way that they presented was like, the XFL, that was crazy, wasn't it? They had, Tommy Maddox played in the XFL. Did you know that? Like, stuff like that. It's like, if it was a waste for me. And, they also mentioned the name change of the World Wrestling Federation because the WWF came in and said the original WWF, World Wildlife Fund, said, hey, you're using our trademark, and they talk about all of that. But really, at this point of the documentary, they're talking about getting out of, the Monday Night Wars and into ruthless aggression. And for all the wrestling fans that are listening into this is all sort of stories that you've heard and before. That's really not going to, change your mind on stuff. Really, the big things to kind of take away from this documentary was the stuff about Shane and Vince and their relationship, and really how Vince just used his powers to book himself into storylines where, as you mentioned, he would just, get in relationships and storylines with all the women on the roster and do these affair storylines in front of his wife and his kids that, looking through a modern eyes, is just it's has not aged gracefully. Let's just say that.
And then I was going to say, like, the finish here, or the biggest story of this, is the one where Stephanie didn't want to say what the angle that she refused to do, and then Vince is like, I think it was me impregnating her.
Right, yeah, that one too.
Like, what? Best for business? Let me ask you a question here, and this is a little bit off of Vince McMahon. I don't know, because look, Trish Stratus, I think, is she's sort of a Canadian icon. She's I think she's handled herself very, very well. And I don't know Trish Stratus. I haven't heard people say bad things about Trish Stratus. I guess my question is, in watching this, so I'm just trying to piece this together, that somebody thought it was okay, that Trish Stratus thought it was okay to go out, make out with Vince McMahon because Linda McMahon apparently said it was cool, on TV in front of everybody, and then get in the ring and be told to get down on all fours and bark like a dog. Like, Vince McMahon, the owner, the man, is the powerful and can do anything and make the woman do whatever he wants. That's okay, because it's going to pay off at WrestleMania when I slap him. But then when she's asked to kiss a girl, and I'm not saying, like, she can do whatever she wants, and if she's not comfortable with it, that's totally fine, and that's up to her. Everyone needs to do what they're comfortable with. I guess I'm just having a hard time understanding that Trish Stratus was comfortable in making out with Vince McMahon in front of his wife, and comfortable with getting down on all fours and barking like a dog, but then wasn't comfortable in kissing another girl and lost her title the next week.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I do wonder if that sits because Trish was so new to the industry when she joined the WWF at that time. Like, she was only a year or two in the industry at that time, where, we hear a lot of times where sometimes, the term of working yourself into a shoot.
Yeah.
I for me, and this is just me speculating, I have no idea. I'm the same ballpark as you, Lee. I don't know Trish Stratus. I've heard lovely things about Trish. I've heard she's great. But at that time, especially when the boss is telling you to do something and you're so new into the industry, you're only a year or two in, and you're thinking, hey, maybe this is a big break, that maybe she's thinking, oh, like, at the end of this all, there's going to be this big payoff and storyline, so it'll all work out at the end, and kind of worked herself into a shoot at that point, trying to ignore sort of the negatives. And then that point that you mentioned when it talks about the Mickey James storyline, where she's much more established as a vet. She's one of the top women in the division. She has more say in what she wants in terms of her storylines. She can have that control to say, hey, I don't want to do this part of the storyline. And then, as you mentioned, they talk about how the next week she loses the title. I think that's where I kind of look at it. Obviously, I could be wrong, but that's how I kind of took it away, because I was a little confused about that at first. But, you know, sometimes, and one of the things, too, with this documentary that I thought was interesting, not a lot of women on the documentary.
Nope.
Not a lot. You had Trish, you had the female journalist, by the way, Sharon Mazer. You had Linda, you had Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I'm missing somebody else, Wendy Richter. And that was really it. That's off the top of my head in terms of, you had Bonnie Hammer. You know, and that's kind of an indictment too, that it's like, I'm trying to think of all the women that are in this documentary. It's like, it's like 6.
Yep.
And you think of all the male talents that are on there. That's also not a good thing for Vince as well.
And especially, like, great to have the female talent, but how many females are on there that had disagreements or didn't like him, or, you know, like, it's all his wife and his daughter and people that aren't going to make any ripples.
Yep.
Aren't going to make any waves. So let me end with this. And this is sort of a question beyond the documentary. After watching this episode number 5, and seeing the real division, at least on screen, and again, it's hard to tell exactly, but it seemed, and we both agreed, that it seems like there is a division between Shane and Vince McMahon. Does that lend more credence to Shane McMahon going to AEW and forging out maybe not his own path, but a path with somebody else, somebody different?
I think it's possible. When I came out of this, and, you know, the timing of this documentary, you know, a little bit after, there was the photo that the Young Bucks had with Shane McMahon at the airport. So it's possible. And I think
I'm not asking you though if it's possible, because look, anything's possible. It's
right.
Wrestling.
That's true.
So, like, anything's possible. For me, it gave the rumors more credence. I believed the fact more that Shane McMahon could go to AEW after watching this, because of what I considered the real division within the family. Not just like, I'm not super cool with what Dad's doing, I need to go try something else. Like, there seems to be a real division. And I thought at the end of it that he's got more of a chance to go to AEW because of what I saw on the documentary. Did you feel that way or no?
Yes, I did feel that way. It strengthened it for me, for sure.
Okay.
It definitely strengthened it for me. Because now I think you got more people that are sympathetic to Shane that are watching this and saying that, you know, wherever he goes, whatever he decides to do, whether it is in the wrestling industry or he goes back out and tries to do his own thing business wise, I think there's going to be growing support for him.
I agree.
And so, and there's going to be this encouraging of, you know, he's going to go out there and prove he could do it on his own. And Shane has always been, of the McMahons, the sense I've always gathered, that Shane is the most liked McMahon out of all of them over the last couple of years. So I think that only adds more credence to that more people would want to support Shane and wherever he goes, whether that be AEW or otherwise. So yeah, I definitely strengthened it for me.
Okay. And so I thought so too. And I kind of thought of the rest of the family. Linda McMahon, certainly Stephanie, and, you know, Triple H, that they've all just sunk themselves completely into the business and will do whatever it takes. Linda McMahon will go out and watch her husband do this, and Stephanie will get left at the altar and then get crucified, and then all the things that she was willing to do for the business. And not to say that Shane didn't, but he left He didn't marry into the business. He seems to be his own guy, and his own guy that didn't get the love from his father and his family that maybe he needed at some point. And so I do think that strengthens his case to go elsewhere. And because exactly what you just said, I felt more sympathetic to Shane after watching this episode. And I think it'll be interesting to see where the future goes. And I'm looking forward to the last episode. I'm hoping that a lot of things get answered. So we will look forward to that. And that'll be our final broadcast. Zach, always good to talk to you. And anything else you wanted to get in about this one?
No, I thought the family dynamic stuff was interesting. Otherwise, there's been a lot of, kind of glossing over things and not really going deeper into stuff like I wish they would. Like they mentioned the Playboy interview, which has kind of been the basis of how people have known about Vince's childhood and his upbringing. And they also, they touched about the Sable stuff and all that, but it went back to being where I didn't know what this documentary wanted to be, whether it be a look into Vince McMahon or a history of WWE documentary. It really felt like it was kind of counter. It didn't really know what it wanted to be. And so that was sort of my takeaway from episode 5. So we'll see with episode 6, the final episode. Can't believe we've been able to get to this point and all the audio we've recorded, and we're only one episode away from finishing this puppy up. So should be a fun one.
The Finish, the name of the episode. And I have to tell you, we were just kind of talking off the air. So when I watched episode 5, I have watched these episodes in the weeks that we have done the episode. So I've only watched one a week. And my thoughts are of watching the episode and then we do the podcast. So last week, I talked about this idea of who's a father figure. Seems like all of the other wrestlers feel like Vince McMahon was a father figure, but his own son, not so much. Well, in episode 6, that kind of fleshed itself out, and I had no idea that was actually the case, which I thought was interesting. But so this finishes up the 6 episode documentary. We're going to get into like what episode 6 is, but let's talk about kind of the overall. Now that we've watched all of the episodes, I want to get an instant feel from you on like we'll talk about this at the end, but the finality of what you think this series was, the idea of what it was, and then how well it was executed by Netflix.
Yeah, I think in terms of this series, the way it kind of went and the way it was portrayed, it combined two things into one. It combined looking into the controversies of Vince McMahon throughout his life and kind of looking at what those controversies and how it kind of formed the person that we now know of today when it comes to Vince McMahon, while also being a timeline of the WWE and what happened in their history, and going a little bit deeper than what WWE usually likes to talk about in their own documentaries. And from that standpoint, I think that was one of the things that's kind of been an issue with this series over the last 6 episodes, because it didn't really know what it wanted to be. It didn't know if it wanted to be this documentary that really dug deep into Vince McMahon and all the controversies, for lack of a better term, that looked over this man over his multiple decades in the wrestling business, or if it simply wanted to be kind of the unauthorized documentary of WWE, where it looks at the timeline of everything WWE, including, talking about the different eras and different stars that were at the top of the mantle. So it's one of those things where I don't even think it knew what it wanted to be at points, and it led to some times where stuff that they could have dug deeper on, they didn't dig deeper on, and there were other topics that I felt they focused too deep on that weren't relevant in the case of when we're analyzing the character of Vince McMahon. So I found it to be a mixed bag at points.
Do you attribute that to the scandals that came out mid-documentary, or do you like how much they had to change what they were doing in the middle of making the documentary when everything came out in 2022?
I do think that played a factor. I am sympathetic to that production team because, you know, we've heard that they had all this stuff sort of organized and ready to go, and then the scandals hit, and obviously they couldn't present it in a way that they initially wanted to, because otherwise it would have just looked odd based on what it sounds like the final cut was going to be. So I am sympathetic in that sense where they did have to change things around, and they did have to go a different approach when it comes to how this documentary series was going to be approached. At the same token, though, I think the way that this initial documentary was looking also made me think maybe they were just kind of taking the wrong approach to begin with. Based on the clips that were used, based on some of the topics that were chosen, and some of the stuff that was kept into this version of the final cut. I think it's a little bit of both. I think the original vision of this was something that I personally didn't think they should go down when it comes to analyzing the character. And then other aspects too, where the scandals surely did do a factor in terms of how they wanted it edited and how they wanted it portrayed on Netflix.
So episode 6 begins with Vince McMahon being asked and talking about his two different brains, computers in his head, working against him at all times. I thought this was one of the biggest I don't know if it's ego, it's selfishness. Him talking about the different computers in his brains, and one is thinking of something different other than sort of what's going on at the time. And the third one makes it hard for him to pay attention. I'm watching this going, isn't this everybody in life? Like, not necessarily, because he ended up talking about, well, one's thinking about having a lot of fun and involving sex, and like, you're just disgusting. But don't we all have times where you're doing something, but you're thinking about something else, and you're trying to focus, and you're maybe not as focused as you could? It just sounds like such an excuse to bad patterns of behavior.
Yeah.
So already you're starting off with, it's not that he said it, it's the fact that he's using it as an excuse as to what he might have done in the past, because he's just not able to control all of these thoughts in his head. Well, welcome to life. You know, welcome to everybody else having multiple things going on in their lives and having to try and focus on one of them. And it is absolutely zero excuse for bad behavior. I was really bothered. It wasn't the fact that he's saying that I want to have a lot of fun and it's involving sex. It's like, yeah, we know that about you. Like, I don't, like, that part about you is just kind of the part where you go, okay, you're kind of disgusting.
Yeah.
But it was the overarching, you are doing this and saying this as an excuse for a pattern of behavior. Like, no, you're not different from anybody else. So that really bothered me.
Yeah.
Like, just like, and the show hadn't even started yet. And that's bothering.
Yeah. Well, the fact that he would even just straight up say it involves sex, especially considering what we know about Vince McMahon and the lawsuits that are now out there when it comes to Janelle Grant and also with Rita Chatterton in the past and the other NDAs that are out there that we don't know their stories yet, if they will ever be revealed. I think the fact that he would just kind of openly admit it is a little concerning. And like what you said, kind of using it as an excuse of, having these different computers in his head, as he calls it, and one's thinking one thing, the other's thinking another thing, and the other is thinking another thing. I think in terms of starting the episode off like that, and it really does kind of set a tone for everything else in terms of what they analyze, because this was the episode where they went into everything when it comes to the lawsuits that have been put out. Yeah, it was I thought it was a weird clip, not because that they chose it, because I think it was important for them to choose it, but also more just Vince would just openly say it and admit it when others would just not be. I don't think you or I or other people would just straight up say, "Oh, I'm thinking about this all the time," and just openly admitting that. Like usually, it's kind of kept internalized.
Right. So, I do understand the transition to the Chris Benoit part and everything that happened with Chris Benoit, because it ended up, jumping into, Chris Nowinski being a part of it. And again, what really stuck out is, like, for me, there are two completely different parts to this. Number one, when they kind of focused on the steroid issue, right? Like, it was roid rage. And when Vince said that there was no correlation between steroids and what Chris Benoit did, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not sure I believed it at the time, because I thought it was more about CTE, and like, I didn't think it was roid rage. I mean, you can't, when it's happening, you can't rule anything out until you know. But it wasn't first on my list, like, oh, Chris Benoit had roid rage. And then they bring up, so I believed him when he said that it had no correlation. It's just right after it. They talked about CTE, and he talked about having absolutely zero responsibility, and him just saying that some people are flawed and Chris went nuts was like, oh my God. Like, people are flawed and you've gone nuts. And that's happened multiple times, and you just cover it up, and did not think that there is even possibly a link. And I'm not faulting Vince McMahon. Chris Benoit was a wrestler before he met Vince McMahon, right? Chris Benoit was somebody who decided that wrestling was going to be his choice in life. And look, I'm not Chris Nowinski and don't have the brain scans in front of me, and can analyze it like a doctor, but I don't think you have to be a doctor to go, that guy's probably had more head trauma than most people that you would know.
Yeah.
Because even in the world of professional wrestling, where there's a ton of head trauma, and then for them to say, like, it actually bothered me a lot, Zach, for them to say, well, I don't think it had anything to do with no responsibility. We protect ourselves. We're professionals. And they're showing the bear. But we did change the bear headshots with the chair. We did change that. Well, you changed it because people are hitting each other with steel chairs in the head with no protection. And it happened all the time. And then the Undertaker gets on there and is like, it really bothered me when they took away the chair shot. Did it? It really bothered you, did it? Because you're old school? I kind of lost a little respect for the Undertaker in this episode, because I can understand you're old school, but for anybody to sit there and say that repeated shots to the head with a steel chair with no protection, consistent head trauma, that leads to GTE and people doing, and Steve Austin as well. I should include him in this.
Yep.
He's like, I just don't believe in CTE. Okay. Well, the science says that you should. And the science says that even if you don't necessarily agree, or like, you can't say I don't believe in it, because the facts are proving otherwise. This isn't like I don't know, it's not like a you believe it or you don't believe it, because
it's not a theory.
Yeah.
It's not a theory at all.
You're right. It's not like up in the air. These people's brains, go look at Lyle Alzado's brain.
Yep.
Go look at people. And unfortunately, and I know we're making the world safer, and I think that's great. We're trying to do everything we can to prevent concussions. And we've come so far due to people like Chris Nowinski and others that have really, gone a long way in this. But you don't have to be on the side of doing everything in your life that's precaution, but to say that, like, you don't believe in it. I think, Zach, we're going to come in a lot of different sports, in more wrestlers and more football. We're going to see what people's brains are like in the next 20 and 30 years. And I don't think it's going to go in a very good direction when it comes to physical contact sports. I think we're doing things now to make things safer for when, the 20 and 30 and 40-year-old now becomes 60 and 70 and 80. I think we're going to, in 50 years, it's going to be better. But not in the next 10 years, 20 years, because those people were not protected. And I just don't, you got people sitting up there talking about, from Vince McMahon to The Undertaker to Steve Austin, saying that they don't believe in it. And I was mad when they took away the chair shot to the head without protection. Well, the world has survived, Mark, without, when people get their hands up to protect so the chair isn't hitting them flush on the head. We've survived in the wrestling business. This is a difficult part for me. I know it didn't have as much to do with Vince McMahon as it does the CTE issue, which you're kind of talking about it getting away from Vince McMahon. Mm-hmm. But Vince McMahon not having any responsibility in what these people do. No, I'm not faulting him for Chris Benoit. I am faulting him for running a company that it's like Gary Bettman, and never acknowledging, won't give anybody any credit. He'll just keep denying it, but then keep making changes because he knows it's true. Well, Vince McMahon, I think, kind of did the same thing, but this out and out, like, I don't want to be a part of the solution, really bothers me. And Vince was the head of it because it was his company.
Yeah, especially the way that whole segment kind of played out. It was weird because they obviously brought on Chris Nowinski on this episode, talked about CTE, they talked about the Benoit stuff, as you mentioned, and, we could do a whole episode on the Chris Benoit tragedy and what happened there. I obviously believe that not only was it CTE, but I think it was a multitude of factors, but CTE was certainly the primary factor when it came to that. You look at the scans that they talked about with Chris Benoit's brain, and I'll always remember it. They always talk about with Chris Benoit's brain, the condition that his brain was in was similar to an 85-year-old with Alzheimer's disease, was just the state of his brain. And so as we learn more about concussions and CTE, as you mentioned, we're not only just learning about it here in wrestling, but also in other sports. I mean, we're going through it right now with Tua Tagovailoa and the multiple concussions that he's gone through, and the debate and the talk about, concussion protocols in physical sports like football and hockey. I thought it was weird, like what you touched on, like all these wrestlers, how they embraced, in a way, the research that Nowinski was doing, but also in this episode, kind of were pushing back against it, saying, "Oh, this is not real science. Like, this is just a guy trying to make a something out of nothing." And like what you said with, Undertaker talking about how, he was upset that the chair shot to the head was taken away. It's like, well, if you look back at Undertaker's career and you see some of the headshots to the head, chair shots to the head that he's delivered to other wrestlers, I could think of Chris Kanyon off the top of my head, Mr. Kennedy as well, JBL, all these wrestlers. Like, I think in terms of aging well, those chair shots haven't aged well. And you look back, even if you're somebody that does go back and watch Chris Benoit matches, and I know there are some that don't, and I totally respect that, but if you go back and watch some of those Benoit matches and you just see the shots that he took to his head throughout his career, not just, as you mentioned, WWE, but even before then when he was wrestling for WCW and New Japan and ECW, it just, unfortunately, a lot of the signs were there. And I was very disappointed, especially in Steve Austin's response about how he's just not a CTE guy. He doesn't believe in it. In my mind, that's just something you just can't you can't say, "I don't believe in it." Like, it's not a theory, like I mentioned before. This is hard-nosed evidence, science, and that's being continuing to be built upon to this day. The more and more we learn about CTE, the more we learn about concussions, this is just something that you just can't say, "I don't believe in it." And so all of this was kind of interesting because it was both like, oh yeah, we embrace this into our company, but also we don't really fully believe in this. It came off to me like, okay, we're just going to embrace this because this is going to be a nice PR move for us. And we could tell, media folks that, hey, we are taking this issue seriously. But what we actually believe in when it comes to concussions is not in line with what Nowinski kind of outlines in terms of his research into CTE. So this kind of took up a bit of the episode in terms of the discussion around concussions and also, wrestlers dying. They showed that HBO Real Sports interview where McMahon, knocked the papers out of the guy's hand. And
I want to stop there because I do want to talk about Armin Katayan.
Yep.
Who, Armin Katayan is not just another journalist, just like when Vince McMahon did it to Bob Costas.
Mm-hmm.
Like Armin Katayan with HBO Sports and before that with CBS, like this is a big time guy. This is not just Joe Henry. Pardon the pun.
There you go.
Interviewing Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon getting mad. And this was again another example of when you aren't in control, how do you react? Vince McMahon, not in control, literally looking like a snot-nosed 13-year-old person who's not getting their way. So they're going to make a face and they're going to slap the things out of your hand because they're mad. Oh my God. Like, it is like watching a child. And to think that somebody can get, like, that gives me insight. And look, you can't completely put one and one together to make two here, but that gives me insight into other areas in his life on what it takes to trigger him. Because you've seen, like, of any time that you're going to be calm and in control is going to be with a big time reporter on national television. That is, you think about the times that you need to be in control. It's with big time reporters on national television because that is going to be headline material wherever that goes. And to be so irritated so easily and to act like a child and your anger is coming out because you're not in control in those type instances, Zach tells me, and this is an opinion, but it tells me that in other scenarios where you think you're in control, where there's no cameras and the people aren't like at your level or above you, you think you dominate and control everything. And if somebody triggers you, all you're going to do is react in a way that's going to be angrily and more taking control. That's what I got. Because if you can't keep control in those situations, imagine somebody talking back to you almost like a kid to a parent, because that's how you see it as a person who thinks that they control everything, that everybody's underneath you and you just control everything. So the cameras aren't there. There's someone much younger than you trying to tell you no at that point. Like Bob Costas and Armin Katayan are trying to tell him no, or at least engage with him in a conversation that he might not be right about. And he can't keep his control then.
Yeah.
Let alone in private situations. I was blown away by that one as well. The Armin Katayan interview.
Yeah.
I really was. But I do think it's interesting that of all of those things that happened, right? They did reduce the days. They did take some of, like, the pressure that came from some of those things, from the concussions and from the time on the road and overworked, and the changes did come. So I guess that's it. It reminds me so much of the NFL, or sorry, the NHL, and both leagues.
Yep.
But when we're not going to acknowledge a problem, we're going to tell you no. But then in the future, we'll make these little minor adjustments as it goes along. But don't worry, that's got nothing to do with the pressure and what you said about facts beforehand. Like doctors and scientists, and no, it's got nothing to do with the facts that you presented. We're just going to make these changes anyway. Right? Like, come on. How stupid.
Yeah.
So then quickly after that, right, it moved on to the streak. I want to ask you something. Do you believe that Vince McMahon changed his mind about the Undertaker's streak on the day of WrestleMania 30?
I don't. I don't really. I that time, so that was when I was just starting to get into the sheets when it comes to reading backstage stuff. Yeah. And the sense I gathered was at that time Brock was just not being pushed the way he should have been pushed when he returned to WWE. And this was an opportunity for them to kind of get him back on track. And what better way to get him back on track than to have him beat Undertaker and beat the streak, especially for a guy that Taker respects in Brock Lesnar. I think that was... I don't think Vince changed his mind the day of. Now, it is I could understand why people would believe it, because we know with Vince, especially years after that, how, you know, they would have show formats put together for that day. And then, you know, Vince would come in and he would throw everything up and say, hey, we're not going to run with this. So I could see that. But something about this just doesn't feel like that's true to me.
Okay, sorry to cut you off, but you're right. They made changes, last minute changes all the time. Let's not confuse that with the biggest kind of part of WrestleMania, which was the streak of The Undertaker. So in your biggest show of the year, the biggest moment, or at least in your top two moments, so like everybody came to WrestleMania to see the streak. This isn't Monday Night Raw and you don't like something and it's 6 o'clock and you know what? Screw that. We're gonna redo it. This is WrestleMania and the Undertaker's streak. I just don't believe it for a second.
Yeah. I did get a kick out of Vince saying, because they try to tie it in from the previous concussion discussion, where Taker was saying he was concussed 5 minutes in the match, and Vince was saying, well, he might have had a concussion, but it also might have just been traumatic for him. It's like, oh my God. Yeah.
He can't remember the match because it was traumatic that he got told that he was going to lose.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wrestlers get told they're going to lose every day. every match that goes out there, for the most part, there's a winner and there's a loser.
Yeah.
And I understand he hadn't lost at WrestleMania. But we're supposed to believe someone that comes on and says he was so overcome with trauma
and emotion and all this
because he was going to lose that he blacked out and doesn't remember in the biggest moment of one of his, at that point of his career, losing the streak and losing at WrestleMania. No, I'm pretty sure I'd remember that forever. You talk to coaches, you talk to players, and you're like, oh man, you won the Stanley Cup 3 times. You're like, yep. But you know what? I certainly remember the time we lost it. That's what they say, right? The losses hurt way more than the wins. I don't think when I watched The Undertaker get dropped on his head from Brock Lesnar in the middle of that match, and he looks like he's concussed, I'm pretty sure when he didn't look concussed before that point, and from that point on, he looked like a deer in headlights. I don't think it was from the trauma of being told that he was going to lose. Getting me more angry as this goes along. Because you just think about all the things about him that are pointed out. And this is what these documentaries are made for. I don't think it necessarily hit the nail on the head because we didn't need to talk about CTE and the streak and all of those things for so long in this final episode. But every time a big issue comes up, this guy is fabricating everything. And it's up to us. And this is a point I really want to drive home with this episode and the whole documentary. With footage on him, but even on other points when people create documentaries and they want to be able to tell the truth. When you don't get the truth, what you do get is people contradicting themselves and basically making things up, in my opinion, on the air. And then you just have to leave it and call them on it. This is what this was for me. Every time a big issue came up, Vince McMahon was fabricating something about that. Not taking responsibility or fabricating, in my opinion. And it's embarrassing. And you have to call him. You can't just leave it, right? You can't just leave it there and go, oh, well, that's just him. No, not at all.
Gotta be Armin Catan. Challenge it a little bit.
Right. So then we get into, again, the relationship with Shane McMahon and Vince McMahon. And Shane coming back in, getting a call from Dad, getting the hug, and even more. I know we've talked about this already, but like I brought up at the beginning of this, I really didn't know how much they were going to draw on the father figure parts from other wrestlers and the Shane McMahon into episode 6, because I thought they covered it in 5 and I wanted to talk about it. And it just, everything I said in episode 5 about that relationship is even more true when I watched episode 6.
Yeah.
I felt even more empathy for Shane McMahon after watching this episode. Coming back in and doing all of these high-flying stunts, and his dad called him because it was best for business. And did Shane get a high when he came back the first time? Yes. Good for him. But his dad called him back for business, and then his dad gave him a hug, and that's all he's been looking for. And how old was he when he got the hug? I don't know, 40?
Might have been in his 50s at that point.
Yeah, well, too old.
Yeah.
To get your first hug from Dad. Just I get so tired of people that live their lives with a way that they were brought up because it happened to them, it's got to happen to others. And look, there's a point in life where people learn, and sometimes you do have to go through things as a young person to be able to learn on the other side. And some things that, you just because you haven't experienced it yet, sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to go through those things. But when you grow up in a world that bad things happen to you when you were a young person, when you become a parent, and I'm not a parent, so I want to say that, but when you become a parent, wouldn't the first thing in your mind be the opposite? Like, I'm not going to let my children grow up in that environment. I'm not going to have the things that happen to me happen to them. Instead of like, well, they happen to me, so I'm going to make sure that it happens to them too, because I had to go through it. It's like the ultimate narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't really have much more to say on the Shane McMahon thing other than I feel very, very, very badly for him that probably a long time ago he had to come to the realization. And I think he came to it a lot longer in the past than maybe this documentary presented itself. It was almost like he just is realizing now in his late 40s and early 50s that he wasn't going to get control of the company. I think he knew he wasn't going to get control of the company a long time ago. And that's why he left in the first place. Because when you realize whether it's your father or somebody else in the world that they're the ultimate narcissist, to think that that's ever going to change is just fooling yourself. And that's what I think happened to Shane McMahon. I think he knew a long time ago. And he came back and did those things because he loved the business. But certainly interesting, the non fatherly aspect from Vince to his son as opposed to other people, which I know we covered in episode 5, Zach, but I think it bears talking about again here in 6.
Yeah, and going more in depth on it as well. Just kind of talking about making that connection that you were able to make in the previous episode there as well. So yeah, not too much I can add to that when it comes to looking at it. So I think you got that well covered there.
And then they get into what happened.
Before that, they did talk about AEW briefly. They did have some AEW footage in the doc.
Yep.
Talking about Cody Rhodes being there to help build it and then left for WWE, and that was it. When it came to the AEW talk about how that was kind of the alternative, and they also kind of bounced around a little bit on some of the other timeline stuff of what happened to WWE. But then, as you mentioned, they got into the allegations that came out initially back in June 2022.
I think who also came across really poorly to me. There's one thing about loyalty, and then there's another thing about being loyal beyond any of the facts that are presented. And I wish people would just come out and say that they're loyal to a person because what they've done for them has superseded all of the other things. So Bruce Pritchard gets on and starts talking about, like, and look, do I believe him when Vince McMahon did everything for his wife when his wife had cancer and is still alive to this day, probably because of Vince, and he feels a loyalty? Yeah. You know what? If somebody looked after my wife and she was still alive today in the spot of Bruce Pritchard because of somebody else, I'd probably be pretty loyal to those people.
Yep.
Right? Like, I don't begrudge him for being loyal, even if Vince McMahon has done some terrible things. If somebody has really done a lot to basically help save your life, and or somebody that might be more important to you than even your own life, I get the loyalty. I understand how that might supersede everything else, but then just come out and say it. What I absolutely hate is what Bruce Pritchard gets up there and basically says that anyone who thinks they know, they don't know. Dave Meltzer, Shoemaker, and all these people saying all these things, they have no idea what the real story is. And then, okay, what's the real story? Oh, I'm not going to tell you. Okay. It's the fighting back part. It's like loyalty is commendable, even if it's a person, like I said, that's done some really terrible things, but has done some great things for you. I get the loyalty, but just come out and say it. Don't fight back on people when the facts are there. Like if I'm Bruce Pritchard in that spot, I'm basically just saying, look, the guy's been unbelievable to me. And whatever else he's done, I'm not going to sit here and talk about, or I don't really know. But all I know is everything that person has done for me. And this is what he has done for me. And the other stuff, I just don't know. But instead he fires back, right? He's mad. But then when he had the chance to tell everyone the different story, number one, probably because there isn't a different story. And number two, because that's what egotistical people do, is like, don't present me with facts or else I'll yell at you. Well, here's your chance to tell the real story. That no, I can't do that. Anyway, that part again, like I get the loyalty, but for the rest of it, don't understand.
Yep. Well, that's been in Pritchard's playbook ever since he got into the podcasting business, is just to do that sort of deal. And so when he was presented, and here's the thing with a lot of these wrestling types, when presented with the real world, they crumble a lot of the time, especially these Vince loyalists like a Bruce Pritchard, because the real world doesn't really care, and he doesn't have a base that he can appeal to when it comes to, you know, the stuff like that's like Pritchard for the longest time has been a guy who's like, oh, I don't trust Dave Meltzer. What does he know? I was there. He wasn't there. That's all part of the playbook for Pritchard. But that might appeal to a certain segment of the wrestling fan base who kind of grew up on WWE and they don't want to hear anything else negative about the company or Vince or anything like that. But that's not going to work when, as you mentioned before, this is like a professional production with Netflix, and you're given the opportunity to say, hey, well, tell me what really happened here. And he's like, I'm not going to do that to you. And as you mentioned, you know, they brought him back for an interview in 2024. This is, you know, a couple years after the allegations first broke out, and how he's like, oh, this was not fair. You didn't get to see the human side of Vince and all this junk, right? And like what you touched on, this is what he did for me. It's at that point where sometimes there's a lot of people in the wrestling industry that should probably learn this lesson, but sometimes it's just best to just shut up and not just say anything. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately for Bruce, he's somebody that is going to be loyal to the bitter end, and he does not care if it makes him look bad, because in his mind, he's being loyal to a friend. And so on one aspect, it's like, man, I wish I had a friend like him to be that close, even at my worst. But at the other end, it's like, man, you got to recognize the situation that's being presented with you here and get into reality a little bit and understand what's being looked at. And like you mentioned, some of the facts that have been pointed out when it comes to Vince McMahon, and just take a different approach. But this has been part of Pritchard's playbook for the longest time. Whenever he's done shoot interviews or has done the podcast or anything like that, it's always been, no, Vince is great. I was there. You weren't. Dave Meltzer doesn't know anything. Dave Shoemaker doesn't know anything. That's just been part of his playbook for the longest time.
So I do want to get to the end part when the question is asked back in 2022, by the way, what Vince McMahon's legacy will be. Didn't you find it interesting that some of the people that you would consider, like 3 of the people that were asked, maybe it could be more, but at least 3, in Undertaker, John Cena, and Trish Stratus, who all said that he was at some point a fatherly figure in their lives. All of those people have said that numerous times, including on the documentary. Couldn't answer the question because they knew what might be coming, or at least what he's done in his past. And if it ever came out, they didn't, to me, this is how it came across. They knew all of the bad stuff, so they're not going to go on record and say that he's the greatest because they know some of the things already back in 22, and they know probably his history and have known all of the stories. But like his closest people called him a fatherly figure, couldn't answer the question of what his legacy would be. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. I also kind of took away from that yeah, people know about this stuff when it comes to his past and what he's done, and even at that time, so it wasn't too shocking to me that they're like, especially guys like a John Cena who are in Hollywood and they got to maintain a certain PR, a certain public perception, that if he goes on record to say, hey, I think Vince McMahon is a great guy, he's one of the best people I know, he is that father figure to me, that then it would come back to bite him in the future. So they were very selective with their words. Honestly, and this is kind of the thing throughout the documentary that I am shocked to say right now, but in terms of the wrestlers that kind of gave some interesting insight and was not afraid to be blunt, was Tony Atlas of all people. And I thought Tony Atlas kind of put it best, where he, for what we say about him, and it is very much true, he is also arguably the greatest promoter of all time, and that's what he said there. And through hook and by crook, when it comes to Vince, he does have that to his name. But how he got there, obviously, is one that's left to be looked at when it comes to his past controversies, how he's handled certain events in his life. And so, really, the only wrestler that kind of brought a straightforward answer was Tony Atlas. And then, of course, they had Meltzer on as well to kind of analyze how he views Vince, obviously, as somebody that's been covering him since really his rise in the WWE, buying the company from his father. So, yeah, that was interesting. And I think what was not said a lot, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting there, too.
Yeah, well, that's put perfectly. All the people that were very close to him, it was what they didn't say.
Yeah.
Because they know. And everyone knows. And I do think it's a fault of Netflix that you're selecting people. Like, this is where I thought Netflix dropped the ball with this documentary. When you bring people on to give some insight or to give some balance, all of the people that they brought on to ask that question, or what they filmed, or what they edited, or what they released, basically are all like, even Tony Atlas, he didn't throw him under the bus. He just said something that, yeah, look past all the crap, but this is also true.
Mm-hmm.
He probably is the greatest promoter of all time. But all of those people didn't even know what to say, so they basically didn't say anything. Why are there not people on there talking about what the legacy really is going to be? And what it's going to be is, you're not going to be able to look at the good before you see all of the bad and all of the victims and all of the people that were hurt. And it just, I guess it's hard because it's self-preservation. And when you look at between The Undertaker and Austin and Cena and Trish Stratus and like all of these people, it's hard for me to get self-preservation out of my mind. John Cena didn't answer. Self-preservation for his own career. Same with The Undertaker. Doesn't want to throw a friend under the bus, and self-preservation on his part. If you're going to get that as the producers, you got to have the other side as well. Which I didn't think they did a fantastic job on.
No.
Because everybody, and that's sort of life. Everyone's sort of out for their own self-preservation. And you're right, though. Tony Atlas at least said something interesting, because if you do look past all the crap, Vince McMahon, probably the greatest promoter for a long period of time. I mean, you could probably put Don King in the argument at some point for what he did, but it was a shorter amount of time Don King actually did that. But yeah, I mean, Vince McMahon, Dana White, Don King, when it comes to promotion, be very tough to argue.
Yep. Especially in North America.
Yeah.
Because I would, the only other person promoter wise that I could think of that could be considered as in that great promoter category in wrestling would be Shohei Baba in Japan.
Yep.
But otherwise it's pretty much Vince, because as you mentioned, the longevity and all that. And this could be a topic for another day, but I don't buy into the creative genius aspect that some say he is. I don't think he was a creative mastermind. And I think history has shown for the guys that he was able to get over, there are even more that he was not able to get over that got over in other companies. So I push back on the creative genius label.
Yeah, and plus throw in, and as you've done throughout the 6 episodes of this documentary, throw in the WBF and throw in the XFL and throw in a whole bunch of bad business ventures, from the restaurants to, we're going to have shotgun Saturday night in the restaurant. And we're just like so many bad ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so many bad ideas within his own company. But sometimes people just get over because they have the charisma. As much as I don't like the person, the egotistical maniac in Terry Bollea, he had a charisma that people just love.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, Vince brought him in. Vince was buying up talent everywhere. Vince also brought him in as a bad guy in the late 70s. And then let him go. And then brought him back. So, like, is he really that much of a genius?
Yeah.
Anyway, he should be applauded for his creative and risk taking, and the risk taking of WrestleMania 1 and the risk taking of WrestleMania 3 and different things that were accomplished along the way. But the greatest promoter in the history, the most creative guy, no, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of failures along the way that are overlooked because of one success.
Yep, absolutely. And other things I wanted to touch on quickly on this documentary, in terms of episode 6, when they were going over the allegations, and it kind of goes back to the central theme I have with this, where it's like missed opportunities to really break down and look at stuff. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I had completely forgotten about this, but they brought up the stuff with Ashley Massaro on the tour in Kuwait, where it's claimed that she was raped by a man posing as a military doctor around that time. And there was also talk about how Massaro's attorney releasing a statement about how Vince McMahon wanted to have sex with Massaro, and she rejected the advances. And then we see a skit that was on TV later about Vince mocking her, about crying about something. I forget what the story was, but it was mocking her and then throwing a coffee at her during one of the television shows.
Yeah. And
another element of that is they talk about the tanning salon incident that Vince was in and how he was accused of rape in that instance. And then on TV afterwards, a couple weeks afterwards, they show a storyline of not Ashley Massaro, Mickey James. She was in a storyline with her storyline boyfriend, and then she essentially calls rape during the storyline, saying that she was being assaulted and trying to fake it. So that I forgot about, and I was like, man, if you're somebody that was just watching this, you have not watched the WWE product, you look at this, you would have thought it was the fact that he was able to get away with that stuff on TV.
Well, imagine being the person who probably that did happen to in a tanning salon.
Exactly.
Watching that play out on television and being mocked.
Yeah. I used as storyline fodder.
Yeah.
I just, like, that sort of stuff, like, that could have been, like, in a sick way, mind you, but a way that the documentary could analyze how they would look at these controversies and then apply them into their storylines, especially in that 2000s period. And I'll even say it here. We saw it even recently with the Dominic Mysterio Rhea Ripley storyline, where Dominic is holding up a phone to other members of the roster, mainly with Judgment Day, and saying, "Oh, I got these photos on my phone, these unsolicited photos," which is straight up a reference to what was in the Janelle Grant lawsuit about how there were these photos that were being sent around to other members, to Vince, that he would show around to other people that he worked with, and allegedly Brock Lesnar. So, like that stuff's still happening. And one of the things that I thought when they were covering the lawsuits, one of the things that I thought they really dropped the ball on when it comes to it, because they did talk about that sort of stuff. And they did have the reporters from the Wall Street Journal to talk about it, which I thought was good. They needed to have those people. But if you were somebody that wasn't fully aware of the documentary, the lawsuits, you would have thought it was just a Vince McMahon lawsuit. They didn't even mention John Laurinaitis was named in it. They didn't mention that the company WWE TKO is named in the lawsuit as well. So you think it's just a Vince McMahon thing. And the way that they kind of played out is like, well, Vince is gone from the company, and there's this new era of TKO with WWE that's moving on from this and blah, 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 right? But in the same documentary, they show, we talked about earlier, Bruce Pritchard defending Vince and saying, "Oh, I thought this was a bad documentary," and blah, blah, blah. And that guy's still in the company. Michael P.S. Hayes is still in the company. Guys that were close to Vince, that I would argue are Vince loyalists, are still in that company. Vince's son-in-law, Paul Levesque, is still in the company. You know, and stuff named the lawsuit in terms of executives. A couple of them are gone, but Nick Khan is still there. So the way that they portrayed it, the way that they put the angle on this was that, okay, all this stuff happened to Vince while he was in charge, but he's gone now, and we've got this new company that's being moved forward, and they're trying to put a new light on this. And I just felt like that was a supreme dropping of the ball, because there is more to this than just, oh, this is Vince McMahon. This is the culture that Vince has kind of perpetrated in WWE, and those guys that are close with Vince are still in that company. So I thought they really dropped the ball when it comes to covering that end of the lawsuit.
To close this up, the Vince McMahon documentary series on Netflix, it was hard for me to watch Bruce Pritchard say that it basically was a hit job trying to make Vince McMahon look bad. As a person who has followed the career of Vince McMahon, I've read everything that are facts about what has happened and watched him work along the way, and then tried to put myself in a spot where I didn't know anything about Vince McMahon, and I tried to get an idea of what kind of person he was through this 6-part documentary. I personally don't think it was hard enough. So for Bruce Pritchard to say it was only a hit job, only a negative, that's a hard thing for me to believe as a viewer, because I thought there were more questions that needed to be answered. I thought they only scratched the surface on some of the things that really matter when it comes to Vince McMahon. So that was hard for me to watch, him saying that he was only a hit job. So in some final thoughts from you, what do you take overall from this? Was it balanced? Was it not hard enough? Was it too hard?
I definitely wasn't a hit piece, I can tell you that. At no point was I watching this and thinking, man, this is a hit piece on Vince McMahon. At points, I really thought they didn't go hard enough on stuff. I really thought that they kind of looked at things from a surface level. And there's a lot that you can look at and dive deeper into and analyze further that I really think they missed the ball on. And there were other topics that I thought focused too much on, that it became at points a timeline of WWE documentary as opposed to a Vince McMahon documentary. And like I said, in previous episodes, there are times where the history of WWE and Vince McMahon are interlinked with each other. So I understand from that aspect why they would go there. But then there were other elements where they were looking at stuff that I was thinking, man, we don't need to be talking about this. Like, we don't need to be talking about, the curtain call at MSG. Like, that did not need to be dived into. I didn't even think they really needed to talk about the streak ending. I know they tried to tie it in with concussions, but I didn't think it was strong enough to warrant that. So I came away with it thinking, man, when you're watching it, it's like, oh, it is balanced per se, in terms of they looked at stuff, they analyzed stuff, but man, like, in terms of the stuff that this guy has done in his past, I'm not going to answer this question. I will leave it up to the listener. When you look at the stuff that's happened with Vince McMahon in the past, and you think of all the things that he's been alleged to do, from Janelle Grant to the Owen Hart stuff, to Rita Chatterton, to all the stuff with steroids, to the stuff with Snuka, to the Ring Boys, all of this stuff that's in his repertoire, that I haven't even gone into other topics that's happened when it comes to Vince. Is this a man that deserves fairness? Is my question to the listeners. When you look at all the stuff that he's done over the past 40, 50 years that he has run pro wrestling, essentially, when it comes to WWE, and all the things that, frankly, he's been able to get away with when it comes to the allegations, and the way that it was kind of portrayed, does the man deserve fairness when it comes to how he's been portrayed, considering how we talked about how the victims have been treated, and the people that, have alleged stuff against them, how they've been portrayed, how they have not really gotten the fairness that they have deserved over the last couple of decades. So that is only my question to you and to the listeners, because I will not answer that. I want to keep that as a thought, considering all that Vince has faced, has been alleged to have taken part in, and all that. That, sure, you can look at it from an angle of, well, they were able to get everything and get a whole bunch of different sides, but considering all that we've gotten and the lack of coverage on him, does he deserve that? And so, all that to say, I was disappointed in points with the documentary because of the topics that they covered and which topics they decided to cover. I'm glad that there are stuff that was talked about that's now in a mainstream light, and that gives at least an avenue for people to dive deeper into some of the other tragedies and controversies in the life of Vince McMahon. But man, I really did think there were some drop balls here in terms of what they could cover and what they could do with this Vince McMahon documentary.
Ultimately, I wish Netflix, if they wanted to, decided to do a documentary on the history of the WWE and then a separate history on Vince McMahon. And I feel like they combined the two, and it gave us some of each, but not enough of either. And that's kind of my feeling at the end of this. So I think there's been some really good discussion over the course of the 6 episodes. Zach, thank you very much for going through all of this with the listener, with us, and for 6 episodes. We've talked about the Netflix special. I think it's worthy of this type of discussion, and we're eager to hear people's feedback as well. So we hope you've enjoyed the documentary on Vince McMahon from Netflix and the coverage. Zach McGibbon, I'm Lee Versage. This is Wrestling.